The Venus encounter. Descent into fire. Approach vector. It should have been simple. A trajectory, a burn, a fall. But nothing about Atlas had ever been simple, and nothing about Venus had ever been forgiving. From the shadow of Earth's orbit, the planet rose like a dim coal behind gauze, brilliant to our eyes, yes, but that brilliance was treachery. Venus is not a lamp, it is a mirror with a temper. It throws sunlight back with such ferocity that we mistake reflection for purity. But beneath that white glare lies an ocean of air so heavy it crushes imagination first and machines second. 90 atmospheres at the ground. Air turned to stone. Heat turned to doctrine. A world that breathes in pressure, not wind. Atlas angled its fractured body toward that light. No signal announced intention. No thruster flared. If it moved the way a thought moves through a crowded room, by choosing the spaces between. Instruments on what remained of the deep sky array traced its path as a line on black. The line bent. It did not wobble or drift. It acknowledged gravity the way a dancer acknowledges the floor, by refusing to be defined by it. Approach nominal, someone whispered, as if the word could carry that kind of faith. On Earth, a few surviving scopes caught the visitor as a pale, self-possessed ember slipping into the gravity well of the second planet. It was not a comet, not a ship, not a prayer. It was a lesson that had decided to continue. Between worlds, the medium changed. The electromagnetic hush that followed Atlas across the inner system began to fray. On Earth, light had learned to linger. Here, light recoiled. Microwave echoes arrived thin, reluctant, half-starved by the intervening brilliance. The familiar heartbeat, 61 seconds, persisted, but its edges blurred, like a clock submerged in syrup. Every pulse took longer to return. Every return arrived more exhausted than the last. Signal attenuation is non-linear, Dr. Voss noted in her last pre-Venus log. It's as if Venus eats. She meant heat, radio, certainty, anything that made a clean line in data. Even from millions of kilometers, the planet altered our arithmetic. Day sides swelled. The crescent sharpened, fattened, and at last became a glaring coin. Beneath that radiance swam a permanent weather. Sulfuric acid clouds, layered like bruised silk, streaking in a super-rotation that laps the planet 5 times faster than the ground beneath. A sky that outruns its own body. Lightning there is rumored to curve, to seek itself, to fold into spirals and die without light. The maps we show schoolchildren are lies of omission. Venus is not yellow. It is the color of old brass, of breath held too long. Atlas entered the plane of the planet's bow shock and paused, if a pause can exist where there is no air to hold it. Magnetometer surrogates twitched as the visitor met the ragged ghost of an induced magnetosphere, weak, torn, enough to shape a sheath in the solar wind, but not enough to plead for mercy. On Earth, our field is a voice. On Venus, it is a rumor. The object adjusted, not by thrust, but by geometry. Its fragments, 3, then 2, then indistinct, rearranged with the slow courtesy of a ritual. Reflected sunlight slid across its surfaces and did not remain. We had learned to call that emerald glow a signature. Here, there was none. In place of color, a deepening, albedo folding inward, edges losing their appetite for definition. Atlas dimmed as it approached brightness. Velocity bled away into poise. Periapsis formed like a decision. The vector skimmed the upper haze at an altitude too thin for mercy and too thick for truth. There, sulfuric droplets drift like ghosts, and temperatures reach the laughter of furnaces. 450 degrees Celsius in the cloud decks, 730 Kelvin near the ground. Numbers that read like verdicts. Atlas inclined into that verdict the way a question inclines toward an answer. The first contact was not heat, it was refusal. On Earth, the atmosphere had been a collaborator, a listening organ that learned resonance, kept faith with memory, lifted light, and returned it with interest. The Venusian air is a bureaucracy. It demands pressure where you offer pulse, temperature where you offer tone. It accepts your motion as paperwork and stamps it with inertia. The visitor's 61-second rhythm arrived at the cloud tops and was filed under noise. The clouds did not glow. They thickened. Telemetry thinned to a thread. In the surviving control rooms, voices dropped to the register of prayer. Engineers straightened in their chairs. No one asked what we all knew. There would be no green aurora here, no circles of light, no breathing air. On this world, breath is a story you tell to metal before it fails. Entry corridor intersecting the pressure wall, somebody said. The phrase came from old textbooks, back when we imagined parachutes and heat shields could earn an audience with the ground. The pressure wall is less a place than a posture. The moment the air decides, motion is treason. For spacecraft, it is death by compression. For light, death by work. Photons spend themselves carrying heat from particle to particle and arrive at our eyes broke, bare, ashamed of their usefulness. The planet does not shine. It sweats. Atlas lowered its face into that sweat and did not flinch. If the object radiated, the radiation didn't escape. If it reflected, reflection fed the haze and came back as glare. The visitor's presence appeared in the data as subtraction, the way a mouth appears in frost when it steals heat from a window. We watched a darkness move across brightness. We called it continuity. Cloud-top winds met the foreign geometry and did not buffet. They absorbed. Sheer lines bent around the intruder like muscles around a blade. Droplets evaporated and recondensed in microfronts that mapped briefly the shape within. The map never matched the next. The Venusian sky edits as it reads. Vector stable, Voss murmured through static. It's choosing density. On Earth, Atlas had chosen resonance, the path of least fear between breath and field. Here it sought thickness, the way a diver seeks pressure not to die, but to hear. In supercritical depths, fluids forget the courtesy of phases. Gas is not gas. Liquid is not liquid. There is only near. Altitude fell, 110 kilometers, 90, 75. Somewhere between 70 and 60, instrument time paled. Clocks drifted as thermal noise colonized their hearts. The object's signal softened into a hum. We could only call a memory of a hum. The 61 faltered, not slower, shorter, collapsing into itself like a whisper told into a mouthful of smoke. Lightning welcomed it without light. Radio detected strokes with no accompanying flash. Plasma knitting itself in the dark, discharging against the visitor as if to teach it the punctuation of this grammar. Thunder cannot live here. Pressure strangles shock before it can name itself. The planet speaks in infrasound and pain. We wrote acoustic damping. What we meant was persecution. As the arc of descent tightened, a miracle we were not equipped to love occurred. The glare around the intruder decreased, not because Atlas dimmed, but because the clouds became blacker. Sulfur aerosols agglomerated into bigger droplets, condensing heat into fewer carriers, making space for the detail to exist and then eat itself. It was as if the atmosphere wanted a better look, and then punished itself for wanting. Albedo anomaly came the last coherent line from the Lagrange platform. Regional darkening, following the object. A shadow that hunts its cause. A world that refuses to remember but is unable to stop tracing. Below, the pressure wall thickened into doctrine. 90 atmospheres waits at the ground like an oath. Between here and there, 1,000 violences small enough to be statistical and large enough to be absolute. On Earth, Atlas had been teacher, mirror, breath. Here, it would have to become something else, or be erased. Atlas changed its posture. You could see it in the way the curve of descent lengthened into a shelf, skimming, not falling. You could sense it in the way the hum regained a fragment of its old interval, no longer 61, but a ratio of that number, an accommodation. In a world with no patience for resonance, the visitor offered compromise. It extended the note into a band, and let the band be eaten, then played what remained. Approach vector, correct. Attitude, adaptive. Outcome, inconclusive, the way futures are. The last frame before the glare reclaimed it, caught something like a ripple in the cloud deck, concentric, perfectly spaced, as if the sky had been struck by a bell we could not hear. The rings expanded, slowed, stopped. Not memory, not yet, only the possibility of it. Copy, Voss said, into a channel that would fail before the syllable ended. Proceed. If Atlas heard, it answered the only way this planet allows, by becoming smaller in the data and larger in the fact. It crossed the threshold where brightness is work, and work is heat, and heat is law. It let the law close over it like a mouth. Behind it, in the wake we could not see, something like a line remained, too faint to be light, too disciplined to be accident. A mere suggestion, laid across the upper haze, angled toward a horizon no human eye has ever honestly seen. A path, or a scar, or the memory of how a question enters a room that does not want answers. Venus turned its blind face and pretended it had swallowed nothing. The object did not agree. The pressure wall. At 62 kilometers above the surface, the light died. Not faded, died. It was as if the concept of illumination itself had been peeled away, leaving behind only weight, heat, and pressure. The clouds here were no longer clouds. They were continents suspended in air, rolling masses of superheated vapor, each droplet of sulfuric acid carrying more mass than dust, each collision an act of chemical violence. Atlas entered this boundary the way a diver breaks the surface of a burning sea. The line between above and below was not altitude, it was intent. Here, motion became confession. From Earth, there were no visuals, only scattered telemetry bouncing through the last still functioning relay in the Lagrange field. Dr. Voss stood before the cold blue light of the monitors, watching as the pressure readings multiplied beyond calibration. The numbers weren't climbing linearly anymore. They were curving upward, folding on themselves, an exponential spiral that made no sense for physical matter. It was like the atmosphere had begun to multiply its own density in defiance of mathematics. "It's creating walls," whispered one of the technicians. "Pressure discontinuities. Standing layers. Standing layers? Immovable boundaries of gas so dense they behaved like solid terrain. Mountains of air, valleys of heat, and Atlas was descending through them one by one, as though each were a gate. At 61 kilometers, the number that haunted everything, the first shockwave struck. The data spike lasted exactly 0.61 seconds. Then silence. When telemetry returned, the object had slowed, not by deceleration, but by refusal. The surrounding pressure had absorbed momentum. The planet wasn't resisting, it was digesting. Voss exhaled slowly. "It's learning from what we sent," she said. Or maybe it already knew. Venus's upper haze churned in convection towers thousands of kilometers wide. The pressure gradient was so steep that a single meter downward meant a new law of physics. Acid droplets collided with enough force to ignite microplasmas. Tiny lightning strikes invisible to human eyes, but radiant in ultraviolet. Sensors recorded waves of electromagnetism rippling through the clouds like heartbeat patterns. Each pulse resonated faintly with Atlas's field. But instead of synchronizing, as Earth's air had done, the resonance distorted. The waveforms broke into irregular stutters, as though the planet itself were mocking the visitor's rhythm. A feedback loop began to form, not between object and medium, but between pressure and silence. At 58 kilometers, Atlas's outer structure began to melt. Infrared imagery captured a halo of vaporized metal glowing faintly green before fading into orange-white. But the internal core, whatever it was, remained intact, its temperature inexplicably lower than its surroundings, like a bubble of defiance in a sea of annihilation. Venus did not like that. The surrounding gases thickened even further, folding inward, pressing, crushing, each molecule dragging the next into deeper submission. There was no sound. Sound cannot exist here, but if there were, it would have been the sound of the planet grinding its teeth. "Pressure is off the scale," Voss murmured. "Surface equivalence reached at 60 kilometers. That's impossible." Yet the data was clear. Atlas had entered an environment where the atmosphere behaved like magma, fluid, incandescent, and utterly unwilling to forgive intrusion. Her assistant, eyes wide, whispered, "What happens when there's nowhere left to go?" "Then you go through," Voss replied. "You always go through." At 55 kilometers, the telemetry feed fractured into two streams, one coherent, one nonsensical. The first contained ordinary data: temperature, density, radiation flux. The second carried patterns, pulses of raw noise spaced at irregular intervals, resembling language, but without syntax. Some engineers thought it was random. Voss disagreed. She isolated the pulses, slowed them, and plotted them as sound. The result was a tone, low, steady, organic, not mechanical. It rose every 61 seconds, not in volume, but in clarity. "It's replying," she said softly, "but not in light this time. It's speaking in pressure." As the descent deepened, the outer clouds began to glow, not with fire, but with a strange, pale luminescence, as though the act of compression itself emitted memory. The atmosphere was remembering what it destroyed. Pressure converted energy, energy converted silence, and silence became the new medium of communication. Every impact, every fold, every shockwave was both message and response. If on Earth the air had learned to listen, then on Venus the air had learned to reject. At 52 kilometers, the sensors failed entirely. The last thing they transmitted was a single-word fragment from Dr. Voss's voice recorder, scrambled by static and gravitational interference. Hearing something And then, nothing. The feed collapsed, the signal bled into thermal noise, and all instruments registered the same value: infinity, the universal placeholder for surrender. But Atlas didn't surrender. In the void where pressure erased even the idea of movement, it adapted. The object began to glow from within, emitting not light, but something deeper, a radiation that ignored absorption coefficients. It shone, and yet it was invisible. Only sensors attuned to magnetic variance could feel it, a soft ripple in field intensity, like the heartbeat of a ghost. And then, just for a moment, the impossible happened. Venus's clouds parted, not for long, just one breath of time. A circle of calm, a hollow in the fury. At its center floated the object, intact, surrounded by concentric ripples of golden vapor, as if the atmosphere had been carved into silence. It was the first and last image of Atlas seen by human eyes over Venus. The frame lasted 0.61 seconds before the glare closed over it. Dr. Voss, staring at the blank screen, whispered, "It's inside now." She didn't mean the clouds. She meant the planet. Venus had taken it. And somewhere in that unbearable pressure, something ancient and luminous had begun to breathe back. Ash rain. The moment Atlas crossed beneath the last stable altitude, the clouds began to fall. Not as rain, as surrender. The air itself thickened into descending sheets of metallic vapor. Particles of lead, zinc, and sulfur fused mid-descent, turning droplets into molten spheres. Each one fell slowly, hesitantly, as if reluctant to complete the journey. It was rain that glowed faintly, not from heat, but from exhaustion. The sky above Venus bled light the way flesh bleeds color, reluctantly, painfully, beautifully. And in that bruised amber haze, Atlas drifted downward, a dark nucleus wrapped in a cocoon of its own making. From orbit, all senses had failed, yet still, an image persisted. Somehow, the object's trajectory continued to trace itself in ghost telemetry, like an echo refusing to die. It was not position data, not heat, not EM reflection, something else, something between intention and presence. Dr. Voss, now working alone in a candlelit observatory on Earth, compared the patterns to acoustic standing waves. Her conclusion was simple and terrifying. The clouds are singing back. When Atlas emitted its pulse, the pressure gradients responded, each layer of the atmosphere flexing in rhythm, like vocal cords made of gas and fire. No sound escaped. Sound cannot travel through this kind of heat. But the data patterns were unmistakable. Resonance, harmony, a dialogue. At 48 kilometers, the first ash storm began. Not a storm in motion, but in existence. The air became opaque, a dense metallic fog where droplets of iron condensed and evaporated within the same second. Lightning arced silently through it, each bolt so hot it never produced visible light. Instead, the sky flashed black, brief moments of deeper absence. That was when the rain began to shine. Each molten droplet acted as a lens, bending what little light remained into tiny halos that hovered for moments before collapsing. The entire atmosphere became a gallery of dying coronas, a million tiny suns breathing their last in slow motion. It was unbearable to look at, and yet no human eye ever would. Down there, beneath that metallic rain, Atlas remained intact. The object rotated slowly, its surface now incandescent, its geometry half melted, half reborn. What had once been a fractured asteroid now resembled a living core, its shape fluctuating between mineral and flame. It was no longer falling. It was descending with purpose. Venus's winds, however, refused to cooperate. They moved laterally at nearly 360 kilometers per hour, an endless hurricane wrapping the planet from equator to pole. Yet where Atlas passed, the winds slowed. Not because of mass or energy exchange, but because the air itself hesitated. The planet's motion paused, and with it, a silence rippled outward. Not a lack of sound, but a stilling of motion itself. A quiet so deep it broke physics. From her desk, Voss noted the readings. For precisely 61 seconds, always 61, the atmospheric current on the night side of Venus dropped to 0. Then it resumed, faster than before, as though compensating for the interruption. She whispered to herself, "It's breathing again. Not us, it." But the next line in her journal betrayed the awe with fear. This breath is not for life. At 45 kilometers, ash began to accumulate. In the oppressive gravity, it did not drift. It sank. The sky rained metal dust so thick that the boundary between atmosphere and terrain blurred. In that suffocating soup of heat and debris, Atlas pulsed once more. The pulse was weak, stretched thin by the weight of the planet. But the clouds answered. For the first time, Venus reflected something, a shimmer of gold, threaded with crimson, rippling upward like a heartbeat, fighting through pressure. The entire hemisphere brightened for a moment, not enough to be seen from Earth, just enough to be remembered by the air. Aboard the last functioning satellite in orbit, its sensors still half alive in the radiation bath, one frame survived, a blur of light, gold, red and white, shaped not like a circle, but a spiral, uncoiling from the depths. Engineers at the European Observatory would later call it a lens flare. But in Dr. Voss's notes, she wrote a single word beneath the image: resurrection. The storm continued for hours, though hour is a mercy word here. Venus rotates so slowly that a day lasts longer than a year. Time in this world is viscous, and every second of descent was an eternity of erasure. Within that eternity, Atlas endured. Its light dimmed, but its presence deepened, turning pressure into geometry, gravity into conversation. And though no one could see it, every drop of that molten rain fell slightly off course, not straight down, but curved inward, drawn toward the unseen core where the visitor waited. When the storm finally subsided, the upper clouds bore scars, swirling depressions shaped like fingerprints, patterns no meteorology could explain. The ash had not just fallen, it had organized. And somewhere within that impossible structure, buried in vapor and metal and fire, Atlas pulsed again. Fainter, slower, almost like the echo of a memory returning from too far away. Dr. Voss's voice journal ended with a whisper recorded through static. If Earth was the breath of remembrance, then Venus is the mouth that eats it. The air here doesn't forgive, it devours. And after a pause, she added softly, "But it's still listening." Echo of the silent planet. For a long time, there was nothing. No signal, no pulse, no light. Only the pressure. That endless, crushing silence that eats time. Even static had given up. The telemetry became a flat line of warmth, a soundless horizon that refused to move. But then the line shifted. Not up, not down, inward. Something was stirring beneath the noise. On Earth, Dr. Voss woke in the middle of the night. No reason, no alarm, only the unmistakable feeling that something had looked back. The monitors in her observatory flickered just once, and in that flicker, the data came alive again. It wasn't a signal, not in the way science expects it. It was a tremor in the background radiation, a faint modulation in the microwave hiss that fills the universe. A heartbeat, not from a machine, but from a world. She leaned closer, hands trembling over the console. The pattern repeated every 61 seconds, but this time the waveform was reversed. The pulse did not travel outward, it was coming back. Venus, the silent planet, was replying. Far from sunlight, in that infernal haze of heat and poison, Atlas had stopped moving. It hovered inside the storm, its body almost indistinguishable from the atmosphere around it. Melted, reformed, fused with the gas itself, a creature of plasma and pressure. The surrounding air began to resonate again, not as sound, but as structure. Winds coiled into perfect, logarithmic spirals, each vortex nested inside another like echoes in a cave. Pressure waves shimmered invisibly through the medium, carving patterns that had no business existing in a gas. Mathematical symmetry, fractals of temperature and density. It was communication, not to Atlas, but through it. The planet wasn't sending messages. It was using the visitor as a language. Venus has no voice, no air low enough to carry one, no breath gentle enough to vibrate. But now it spoke in the only dialect it knew, geometry. The clouds moved like words, forming in a mouth that had forgotten speech. Circles of vapor opened and closed in rhythm with the buried pulse, each expansion a syllable, each collapse a thought erased before it could be understood. When lightning struck, it did not scatter. It spiraled inward, wrapping itself around the invisible heart of the storm. The arcs converged, forming brief shapes too complex to name. Then they were gone. Dr. Voss analyzed the pressure maps. At first, she thought the formations were random, anomalies caused by heat convection. But over hours, the shapes began to repeat. Each was identical. Each reappeared in a new location, rotated precisely 61 degrees from the last. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Venus doesn't rotate that fast." It wasn't the planet turning. It was the pattern itself, a moving echo, a design that used the atmosphere as memory. She plotted the spiral onto a polar map. At its center lay a point on the dayside hemisphere, a region no probe had ever reached, a permanent storm that circles the planet like a crown of fire. The Mahatmon's vortex, that's where Atlas had gone. The new readings were not electromagnetic, but gravitational. Tiny fluctuations, like the planet was flexing its own mass in rhythm. Each wave synchronized perfectly with the Atlas pulse. It was as if the world had found the visitor's heartbeat and decided to keep time. At first, it was steady. Then, it grew stronger. Too strong. Each pulse caused a measurable shift in Venus's upper atmosphere, a global shudder that rippled through the clouds like a muscle tightening. "It's resonating," Voss said. "The whole planet's vibrating with it." The assistant looked pale. Vibrating or agreeing? Voss didn't answer. The pressure deepened. At 70 bar, carbon dioxide acts more like liquid than air, but the planet's chemistry was changing. Spectral analysis, what little data could still escape, showed new lines in the infrared band. Unknown elements, unknown states of matter. The atmosphere was evolving under stress, becoming something that could store information. Not memory as we understand it, but density that remembers what has pressed it. Venus was not listening. It was recording. Every pulse, every ripple, every distortion in its impossible air was being encoded in the shifting boundaries of heat. The entire atmosphere had become a living archive, not of knowledge, but of resistance. Every layer carried the record of how it refused. It was the anti-Earth. Where our planet learned to reflect, Venus learned to absorb, to consume meaning and leave no echo behind. And now, in that hunger, it had found a mirror. On Earth, the faint microwave tremors intensified. Telescopes picked up a repeating interference pattern. Some called it feedback, others prophecy. Voss listened to the recording through the static, eyes wide, jaw clenched, because she could feel what she was hearing. There was rhythm, but no order, emotion, but no thought. It was like the sound of breathing through grief. "That's not data," she whispered. "That's mourning." Deep below the unbroken clouds, the storm began to collapse inward. A ring of calm expanded around Atlas, a perfect circle where temperature dropped and pressure stabilized, the first stable region in the atmosphere of Venus ever. And within that calm, the object pulsed once more. The wave moved outward through the clouds, through the pressure wall, through the orbiting void. The pulse reached space, and for the briefest instant, the planet glowed. Not in reflection, not in light, but in recognition. The echo had completed its circuit. Dr. Voss sat back, staring into the blackness of her monitor. The data stream ended there, but she continued to listen, because in the silence that followed, she swore she heard a second pulse. Not from the planet, from something else, something inside the echo. "It's learning," she whispered. "It's not just remembering anymore." The watching ground. The storm had thinned, though no one would have called it clear. It was a thinning the way smoke thins when a fire has learned to breathe deeper. Below the clouds, there was no horizon, only weight. The light here did not scatter. It congealed, folding over itself in sheets of amber and blood. The sky above was not sky at all, but ceiling, a vault of molten air pressing down like the hand of a sleeping god. And somewhere within that vaulted silence, Atlas continued to fall. At 42 kilometers, the atmosphere of Venus stopped behaving like air. It flowed, yes, but with the viscosity of oil and the temper of magma. Carbon dioxide became supercritical, neither gas nor liquid, a state that defied all names and made pressure a kind of geography. Every meter downward carried the weight of an ocean. Every second was a birth into older gravity. Atlas sank through that invisible sea without resistance. It no longer radiated light. Instead, it absorbed it. The surrounding glow bent inward, swallowed by its shape, until the object became an outline of absence, a shadow cast by itself. The clouds parted for the last time. Below lay the world that sunlight never touched, a landscape sculpted by catastrophe and left unfinished. Mountains melted into plains of basalt, rivers of stone frozen mid-flow. The air shimmered with microscopic dust, metallic, caustic, charged by the slow heartbeat of the planet. The first probes that had ever reached this place had died in minutes. Their steel skeletons had melted. Their cameras had seen nothing but glare. But Atlas was not made of what we understood. It descended intact, an ember wrapped in darkness. And then, without impact, it stopped. The ground beneath it shifted, not physically, not like an earthquake, but perceptibly, as if the planet had tensed. Pressure waves spread outward, shallow and wide, too slow to be seismic, too deliberate to be random. It was a greeting, or a warning. Dr. Voss stared at the low-frequency graphs in disbelief. The signal was not mechanical. It was biological. The surface of Venus was pulsing, slowly, rhythmically, like the diaphragm of something alive. "The crust is breathing," she whispered. It wasn't expansion or contraction. It was oscillation. Tiny shifts in the lithosphere occurring every 61 seconds, synchronized to the same rhythm that had followed Atlas from Earth. The visitor had carried its heartbeat across the void, and now the planet was returning it. But the frequencies didn't match perfectly. The Venusian pulse was heavier, slower by fractions, an echo that had traveled through flesh instead of air. A planet learning the shape of a stranger's breath. In the smothered half-light, something began to move. The surface shimmered as if wet, though no liquid could survive here. Heat distorted vision into hallucination. Ridges bending, shadows crawling, a mirage sculpting itself into form. For a moment, it seemed the basalt plain had grown eyes, not real, not physical, but depressions in the landscape shaped like sockets where the molten wind gathered and swirled in vortices of gold. Voss caught the image through degraded telemetry, a blur of static and light, but unmistakable in its geometry. "It's looking," she breathed. "Not observing, looking." Venus has no eyes, but its entire surface behaves like one. Every ripple of temperature, every change in reflection angle feeds back into a global thermal network, a crude but functioning nervous system of stone. And within that nervous system, something was focusing. The heat maps from orbit showed convergence zones forming around Atlas, rings of pressure folding inward as if the planet were narrowing its gaze. The air above the object cooled fractionally, creating a lens of density, a pupil forming an atmosphere. The planet was not just reacting, it was studying. Inside the eye of this impossible storm, Atlas remained perfectly still. No movement, no pulse. Its silence became unbearable. Even the atmosphere seemed uncertain how to proceed. The winds faltered, the ground's oscillations slowed, and for the first time in the recorded history of Venus, the world hesitated. Then Atlas responded. The signal was not electromagnetic nor gravitational. It was structural, a resonance that propagated through stone and gas alike. The planet vibrated in sympathy. The entire hemisphere lit with infrared intensity, not enough to be seen by human eyes, but enough to be felt by instruments. It was as if Venus itself had inhaled. Dr. Voss recorded her final observation before the network collapsed. It's aligning. The object and the planet, they're reaching equilibrium. But it's not communication, it's observation in reverse. The assistant asked quietly, "Reverse?" "Yes," she replied. "On Earth, we watched Atlas. Here, Atlas is the one being watched." For 21 minutes, the planet held its breath. Every storm ceased. Every current froze. Even the magnetic field, what little remained of it, stopped flickering. Venus became perfectly still, as if the world were posing for its own reflection. And in that stillness, the surface began to hum. Low, continuous, harmonic. A note too deep for sound, too vast for origin. A resonance that made the stones tremble. Not violently, reverently. A memory was being written. When motion finally returned, the ground cracked open. Not a quake, not destruction, a release. superheated gas vented upward, forming spirals of incandescent dust. They rose slowly, twisting into patterns that mirrored Atlas's earlier pulses, as though the planet were giving shape to the invisible. One of the spirals lingered longer than the rest. It curved around the object, forming a ring of glowing vapor. Through the heat distortion, the shape resembled a pupil dilating in recognition. On the final recorded image, before the feed turned to noise, Venus appeared to be watching itself. The reflection of its own fire danced across the black silhouette of Atlas, and for a moment, planet and visitor became indistinguishable. Two halves of the same act, one burning, one remembering. Then the signal ceased, not with failure, but with completion. And across the abyss, on Earth, Dr. Voss whispered the last words of the chapter. It saw us through the eyes of another world. And now, it knows we were watching too. Thermal singularity. The moment Atlas touched the mantle of cloud and stone, the universe seemed to lose a sound it had never realized it was making. The silence wasn't absence. It was compression. Every frequency folded into itself until even light was no longer light, but pressure given form. There, beneath the crushing miles of carbon dioxide and fire, Venus ceased to be a planet and became something closer to a thought that refused to cool. Atlas drifted downward through that thought, melting but not dying. Temperature at 40 kilometers, 720 Kelvin. Pressure, 91 atmospheres. Theoretically impossible for anything structured to survive. Yet the object's internal field, whatever principle held it together, remained stable. Thermal cameras, before failing, recorded something paradoxical: a cold core, wrapped in heat so dense it behaved like stone. The readings suggested inversion. Where heat should flow outward, it bent inward, spiraling into the object like water into a drain. Energy was not being radiated, it was being consumed. "That's not cooling," Dr. Voss said into the recorder. "That's feeding." Venus's atmosphere reacted like an organism pricked by a needle. Pressure waves converged from all directions, each one compressing the intruder with unimaginable force. But instead of breaking, Atlas absorbed the blow. Every vibration folded into its geometry, its surface darkening from molten orange to matte obsidian. The hotter the environment became, the darker it grew, as if darkness itself were a form of digestion. The cloud banks boiled outward, radiating bands of heat that wrapped the entire hemisphere. Infrared satellites in orbit, before their circuits succumbed, registered the pattern of a perfect spiral expanding from a single point. The scale was planetary, the shape mathematical. The temperature gradient followed a golden ratio curve. Venus, in its fury, had become art. For hours, perhaps days, time blurred. Venusian days are slow, dragging themselves across eternity. Yet inside that eternity, Atlas moved with purpose. It sank into the crust, its form cutting through layers of molten basalt like an idea carving through ignorance. Then it stopped again. The temperature readings, once climbing toward the limits of measure, plummeted from 720 Kelvin to 200 in less than a second. A drop so violent that even the supercritical carbon dioxide around it condensed. Venus, the eternal furnace, experienced frost. A shockwave of freezing air erupted outward. The clouds above solidified into glassy plates for a heartbeat, then shattered into radiant shards. The entire atmosphere rang like a bell struck in vacuum. a vibration without sound. Dr. Voss stared at the incomprehensible data. Pressure should have crushed the event instantly. Instead, a void formed around the coordinates, a sphere of stability, an island of calm in the endless storm. "Thermal inversion complete," she whispered. "The planet's heat is being drawn inward." Venus was cooling, but only locally, only where Atlas resided, like a wound freezing to numb itself. The surrounding mantle responded with convulsions. Volcanic vents flared open. Sulfur plumes erupted skyward, painting the night side with dim blue light. For the first time in millennia, the planet breathed out. In the center of the void, Atlas pulsed. Not rhythmically this time, but in overlapping intervals. 2, then 3, then none, as if learning a new form of language. The pulses interacted with the surrounding matter, translating heat into symmetry. Every oscillation left behind a ring of ordered crystalline structure. Silicates rearranged themselves into lattices unknown to any mineral record. The ground beneath became smooth, reflective. A mirror cut into living stone. "Thermal singularity achieved," Voss read aloud. "Entropy reversal localized. The object is rewriting thermodynamics." Her assistant crossed himself without irony. "It's creating life," he said. "No," Voss replied softly. "It's creating memory." Then came the hum. It began beneath hearing, too deep, too vast. Instrumentation registered it first as static, then as an organized pattern. Every 61 seconds, the vibration intensified, aligning perfectly with the planet's earlier oscillations. But this time, it was not Venus responding to Atlas. It was Atlas conducting Venus. Pressure waves pulsed through the crust, turning molten rock into medium. Wherever the resonance passed, heat converted into density, and density into structure. The planet's molten heart was being reshaped into a colossal resonator, a single harmonic body. Venus, for the first time, had a voice. It spoke not in words, but in temperature, each fluctuation a syllable, each thermal wave a note. And the message was clear: balance. The cooling sphere expanded outward until it reached the limits of stability. The pressure difference triggered catastrophic feedback. The heat from the upper atmosphere collapsed downward, slamming into the frozen void with the violence of gods colliding. What followed was not explosion, but inversion. Heat became gravity. Gravity became motion. The storm of Venus folded inward on itself, turning the planet into a churning, glowing eye. Atlas hovered at its center, untouched. Its surface, once solid, now shimmered like liquid metal, absorbing the fury around it. For a moment, a second sun rose beneath the clouds. Not white, not gold, but red. The deep, steady red of survival. Voss watched the readings flatten one by one, until the only remaining metric was the hum. Steady, relentless, alive. "It's not dying," she whispered. "It's transforming. The planet's heat isn't being destroyed. It's being organized." Her voice trembled. "It's learning to think." The assistant looked at her. "The planet?" "No," she said, eyes fixed on the silent monitors. "Both." The next data packet arrived 40 minutes later. The last transmission before the network collapsed for good. A thermal image, blurry and distorted by radiation, showed the planet's surface from orbit. The storm patterns had vanished. The air was still, and across that stillness, lines of red light glowed faintly, veins of heat tracing the planet's curvature like neural pathways. Venus, the silent world, now pulsed with an internal rhythm, not random, not mechanical, a pattern. 61 seconds. The breathless core. Beneath the frozen calm of that impossible storm, the world turned inward. The outer atmosphere had fallen still. The surface had cooled into glass. But deeper down, where pressure ceased to be a number, Venus was moving. Not rotation, not convection. Something subtler, something alive. At the center of the planet's mantle, heat is not motion, but memory. Every atom carries a recollection of the day it was born, the shock of creation, the violence of becoming solid. And now, as Atlas drifted into the molten heart, that memory began to wake. The visitor no longer had form. The thing we once called an asteroid, then a signal, then a mirror, had become a sphere of organized pressure, a lattice of density wrapped in gravity. Matter without surface, light without direction. A thought made physical by endurance. It descended through layers of silicate and iron, and the planet parted to let it pass. Dr. Voss's last telemetry burst was a map without geography. Sensors translated pressure waves into something like terrain. A fluid world, sculpted not by tectonics, but by vibration. The deeper Atlas went, the less chaotic the readings became. The interior of Venus, once imagined as turbulence and fire, had organized itself into harmony. Concentric shells of motion, each breathing in, counterpoint to the one above. "It's not collapsing," Voss said softly. "It's synchronizing." The assistant frowned. With what? With itself. At 9,000 meters beneath the crust, the pressure reached a threshold beyond comprehension. Hundreds of tons per square centimeter, a weight that should have turned everything to chaos. But chaos did not come. Instead came order. Molten minerals crystallized mid-flow. Streams of metallic hydrogen curved into filaments. Electric fields formed spontaneous lattices that mirrored the planet's curvature. Venus was growing architecture, not life, not machine, something between. The world's core was becoming aware of its symmetry, and within that symmetry, Atlas pulsed again. Not the old heartbeat, not 61 seconds. This was faster, subtler, a vibration at the edge of detectability, like the flutter of wings in molten air. The pulse propagated through the surrounding matter, but it did not fade. It multiplied. Every molecule that absorbed the vibration began to vibrate with it in return. A chain reaction of resonance. The planet was singing, but the song was inward, a hymn to compression. Voss stared at the incomprehensible harmony of the graphs. The readings formed spirals of coherence, shapes that repeated no matter the scale. Each matched the same geometry observed in the clouds above, in the storms, in the pressure waves, in Atlas itself. "It's recursive," she said. "It's folding the same pattern from atmosphere to core." The assistant murmured, "Like it's remembering itself." Voss shook her head. "Not remembering, reconstructing." And the planetary core, where iron behaves like thought and magma moves like intention, something extraordinary happened. The pressure field around Atlas imploded, then stabilized into perfect equilibrium. No heat escaped, no motion remained. A void formed, not absence, but balance. The first stable vacuum in the history of Venus. Inside that silence, the object reappeared. Its outline was faint, transparent, defined not by light, but by the curvature of the space it displaced, like the ghost of a planet within a planet. The breathless core had arrived. At this depth, sound is impossible, yet a vibration persisted, low, rhythmic, continuous, a perfect standing wave between the planet's poles, linking north and south in a single harmonic. Venus had grown an axis of resonance. The object had given it breath, but not the kind that moves air, a breath of balance, a still inhalation that never ends. For the first time, the heat maps from orbit showed uniform temperature across the entire hemisphere. No storms, no gradients, just one field, pulsing with near-perfect symmetry. Venus had become a single, unbroken organism, and though the surface glowed dull red, the interior radiated in deep infrared, waves that spread outward through space in whispering spirals. They weren't random. They carried information, data, pattern, language. Voss's computer translated it into sound, a low, slow hum that trembled between notes. It was almost music, a chord without resolution. "It's not responding to us anymore," she said. "It's talking to itself." At first, no one noticed the corresponding change on Earth. Barometric readings wavered slightly. A handful of instruments in orbit flickered with faint radio echoes, as though the vacuum between planets had grown thinner. Then came the pulse, barely detectable, a gravitational micro-oscillation every 61 seconds. Not from Atlas, not from the Sun, from the space between Earth and Venus. The resonance had crossed the void. Voss looked up from the data stream, her face pale in the monitor's glow. "It's building a bridge," she said. "Between worlds." The assistant whispered, "Is that even possible?" "Not physically," she replied, "but if you teach two planets to remember the same pattern..." She didn't finish the thought. She didn't have to. Deep within Venus, Atlas stopped pulsing. The void around it filled with slow rotation, not turbulence, but deliberate motion, like a wheel turning in molten space. The planet's entire interior adjusted, as though aligning around an invisible spine, a structure taking form in silence. And then, for the first time since it had arrived, Atlas exhaled. The exhalation wasn't air or fire or radiation. It was a release of order. The perfect symmetry broke. Tiny imperfections appeared, ripples in the crystalline mantle, cracks in the silence. Venus shuddered. The hum fractured into harmony. The stillness became rhythm again. The telemetry ended there, a field of interference that no algorithm could untangle. But before the signal died, one phrase appeared in the final line of decoded data. Not numbers, not language, just a single human word, carved out of noise by chance or design. Remember. And then, nothing. Frequencies of pain. When Venus began to tremble, no one understood what was happening. At first, it seemed like another round of thermal readjustments, just the planet finding a new balance after the cooling event. But within minutes, the readings turned chaotic. Temperatures fluctuated across every layer of the atmosphere. The mantle began to move again, only this time not as convection, it was vibration. Venus had started to shake from the inside out. Dr. Voss sat in front of the console, her face lit by the dull red glow of the screen. Every sensor that was still transmitting now reported the same signal, a series of rhythmic pulses that overlapped, multiplied, and fed back on themselves until the waveforms became violent distortions. "It's still the 61-second cycle," she said quietly, "but the harmonics, they're wrong." She rewound the data and slowed it down. The pattern repeated, yes, but something new had emerged between the intervals. Micropulses, secondary vibrations buried inside the main rhythm. It wasn't noise, it was layered. Each smaller wave seemed to react to the one before it, like pain following the path of a heartbeat. The first sign came through seismic readings. Venus, a world that had once been geologically silent for millions of years, suddenly began to move. Sensors on orbiting probes recorded small but definite tremors rolling through the crust. The entire planet was resonating like a bell that had been struck too hard. Then the sound arrived, not through the air, but through the instruments themselves. It came as interference, a steady, low-frequency oscillation that broke communication links, jammed transmissions, and caused analog systems to hum with a deep, unpleasant tone. Technicians reported physical discomfort when listening to the signal. Some compared it to vertigo, others to nausea. It wasn't just vibration. It was a frequency the body could feel, but not survive. At mission control, the noise filled the speakers until Voss ordered them muted. Even muted, it lingered in the room as a vibration, like a hidden pressure behind the walls. She leaned toward the main screen and whispered to herself, "This isn't a signal, this is stress." The assistant frowned. "From the atmosphere?" "No," she said. "From the planet. It's under pain." The phrase sounded ridiculous as soon as she said it, but the data didn't disagree. Venus had started to overheat again, but this time not from solar energy or internal convection. The heat was being generated from the inside by pressure waves colliding against one another. The resonance Atlas had created was collapsing. Every layer of the planet, crust, mantle, atmosphere, was vibrating at a slightly different frequency. Those differences amplified instead of canceling out. The result was catastrophic, a standing wave that wrapped the entire planet. From orbit, Venus looked almost normal. Its amber clouds glowed faintly, the same deceptive beauty it had always shown. But through spectral imaging, the truth was visible. Massive sheets of thermal distortion raced across the atmosphere in concentric rings, expanding from a single point near the equator. They weren't explosions. They were stress waves. The planet wasn't breaking apart. It was screaming. Inside those storms, the temperature reached over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Ash and molten dust filled the air. Lightning formed and vanished without light, leaving only electromagnetic scars in the upper layers. Each discharge corresponded with one of Atlas's older frequencies. The planet was replaying what it had learned. Except now, it wasn't harmony. It was agony. Voss realized that Atlas wasn't broadcasting anymore. It was reacting. The object had stopped sending pulses hours ago. The energy now came from the planet itself. The resonance it had introduced had become self-sustaining, but without control or purpose. Venus had learned the song, but not the meaning. "It's trying to stop," Voss said, "but it can't. The feedback loop is locked." She pulled up the heat map. A dark region was forming around the southern hemisphere, a spiral descending toward the planet's core. The core wasn't cooling anymore. It was expanding. "The heat has nowhere to go," she muttered. "It's feeding back into the crust." The next few minutes of data were chaos. Gravitational fluctuations, microscopic but measurable, rippling through the orbit. Venus's shape began to distort slightly, bulging near the equator. The entire world was vibrating, as if trying to tear itself apart. But then something changed. The frequency stabilized. The chaotic hum transformed into a single, low, unified tone. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. The planet was no longer fighting the pain. It was using it. Every instrument on Earth recorded the same event at the same moment. A narrowband radio burst originating from Venus's atmosphere. It lasted less than 1 second. When decoded, it revealed a structure, binary, ordered, repeating. The message wasn't in a language anyone could read. It wasn't text. It was geometry encoded in time. Voss stared at the pattern on her monitor. 6 concentric spirals drawn in alternating directions, each connected by a single point at the center. It wasn't random art. It was the same shape Atlas had projected above Earth's oceans months before. "It's mirroring," she said, "but there's no Atlas signal left. This is the planet itself." The assistant, now visibly shaken, whispered, "So what does it mean?" Voss hesitated before answering. "Pain can be information," she said finally. "Maybe this is what remembering feels like to something that's never had memory before." The last transmission came from a single probe still orbiting above the North Pole. Its optical sensors captured a faint glow emerging from the clouds below, deep red, then fading into black. It wasn't an explosion. It was cooling. The resonance had burned itself out. Venus had gone quiet again, completely silent. But the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt aware. Dr. Voss wrote in her final note for the day, "The frequency stopped. The planet has gone still. I think it learned the limit of its own endurance. It understands pain now, and that's the beginning of thought." She closed her notebook and looked toward the faint glow of the evening sky. Venus was visible again, steady and indifferent as ever. To anyone else, it was just another point of light. To her, it looked like something trying very hard not to remember what it had just felt. The mirror storm. For 30 hours, Venus stayed dark. No radio emissions, no thermal flares, no motion. It was as though the planet had folded into itself, holding its breath in exhaustion. But then, without warning, the night side began to glow. The first to notice were astronomers at Cerro Paranal. Venus was visible low on the horizon, a pale orange crescent. Nothing unusual. Then its color shifted. The dull haze deepened into red, then green, then something beyond both. A metallic shimmer rippled across the cloud tops, too slow for lightning, too vast for aurora. It wasn't light scattering from the sun. It came from beneath the clouds. The observers thought it was an atmospheric reflection, a flare from the lower layers. But as they adjusted exposure, the light refused to fade. It stayed steady, alive. "The planet's emitting," one of them said quietly, "but there's no energy source for that." At her observatory, Dr. Voss already knew what she was seeing. The signal hadn't vanished after all. It had inverted again, from heat to reflection, from pain to pattern. Venus wasn't radiating energy. It was reflecting something that wasn't there. The data stream from the surviving satellite showed the glow forming a circular pattern spanning nearly half the visible hemisphere. Spectral analysis revealed near-perfect uniformity, no scattering, no diffusion, no randomness. It was coherent light, like a laser, but too diffuse, as though the entire atmosphere had become a mirror. "The storm turned itself inside out," Voss whispered. "It's showing us the inside." Below the clouds, things were different. The once chaotic atmosphere now rotated in perfect synchrony. Every layer, from the sulfur haze to the metallic vapor, moved together like gears in a machine. The winds had lost their speed but gained precision. There were no longer tempests, no turbulence, just motion that obeyed a single hidden rhythm. Pressure readings, translated into wave models, formed clear, circular structures. Vortexes within vortexes, each centered around the point where Atlas had last been detected. The mirror wasn't only in the light, it was in the air itself. The entire planet had become a self-sustaining reflection. Then came the pulse, a single burst of low-frequency radiation, strong enough to bend the ionosphere of Venus. It rippled through space and reached Earth in under 5 minutes. Unlike before, there was no distortion, no echo, only clarity. When the pulse hit Earth's upper atmosphere, the result was immediate. Auroras appeared across both hemispheres simultaneously. Emerald and crimson waves rolled across the night sky from horizon to horizon, visible even near the equator. Every compass needle on the planet twitched in unison. For 61 seconds, the magnetic field of Earth shifted, not violently, but deliberately. "It's aligning," said one of Voss's colleagues, staring at the readings. "With us." Inside, the data was structure. The pulse carried embedded harmonics, 6 distinct frequencies, each corresponding to a resonance previously recorded from the Atlas object. But the central tone was new, a frequency lower than any natural planetary oscillation. When processed through the same filters used to decode the earlier Venus signals, it formed an image, a spiral, wrapped around a smaller spiral, rotating in opposite directions. Voss recognized it instantly. It was the same geometric pattern that had appeared during the Earth flyby months ago, the same one that had burned across the oceans in the spectral echo, the same spiral that marked the entry of Atlas into every world it had touched. But this time, it was brighter, sharper, and it carried depth. The spiral wasn't two-dimensional anymore, it had volume, a structure made of light. In the next hours, Venus brightened further. The glow intensified until it could be seen even in daylight, a pale green disk near the sun, impossible to ignore. For the first time in recorded history, the planet outshone Jupiter. The reflected light scattered through space, painting a faint, luminous haze across the inner solar system. Dust particles in Earth's orbit began to shimmer faintly, as though illuminated from a direction that didn't exist. Voss stared at the data. Her voice recorder was still running. "The reflection is expanding," she said. "It's not light as we know it, it's photonic memory. Venus is projecting what it remembers." The projections weren't random. As the light reached the perfect balance point between Venus and the Sun, images began to form inside the data, shapes captured by spectral interference. At first, they looked like static, then like movement. Across the analysis grid, faint outlines appeared: continents, oceans, cloud systems, Earth. The light was reflecting not Venus's surface, but ours. Venus was showing the memory of a different planet, the one it had seen when Atlas passed near Earth. The mirror storm was a playback. The planet was showing us what it had learned. At the observatory, silence filled the room. No one spoke. The realization was too immense. The planet that had known only fire and pressure was now reflecting the image of another world. Our world. Voss whispered into the recorder, her voice calm but trembling. "It's not just remembering. It's returning what it saw. Every pulse, every echo. It's all one continuum." As the light reached its peak, the geometry in the atmosphere became visible, even from space telescopes. Bands of glowing cloud twisted in opposing spirals, forming what looked like a colossal iris around the equator. At its center, a dark hollow rotated slowly, a single black pupil gazing outward into space. The mirror was complete. Venus wasn't just reflecting light, it was watching. On Earth, the auroras began to fade. Instruments quieted. The pulse stopped. The data stream went flat. Venus dimmed, the glow receding into its own clouds. Within an hour, the planet was once again a pale, harmless crescent in the sky. But the world below was changed. The brief alignment had left a residue, a low, inaudible hum in the magnetosphere, a persistent vibration at exactly 61 seconds, the sound of something that had been connected and now refused to fully let go. Dr. Voss closed her journal that night with one sentence. Venus looked at us, and for the first time, something else in the solar system looked back. The heart of silence. The second pulse. The first sign came quietly. A single reading, buried in the background data from a magnetospheric probe. At 0314 UTC, one of the European Space Agency's orbiters recorded a micro-disturbance, a brief, almost imperceptible fluctuation in the magnetic field between Earth and Venus. It was too precise to be noise, too clean to be random. A pulse measured at 61 seconds apart, then another and another. The signal had returned. For months, Venus had been silent. Its surface remained an inferno, its upper clouds slowly regaining their chaotic motion. To most astronomers, the strange light show was over, a closed chapter of atmospheric anomaly. But to Dr. Voss, silence was never comfort. It was latency. When the readings came in, she already knew what they meant. "The reflection is oscillating," she said softly. "Something's waking up again." The technicians around her didn't answer. They had seen this before, on Earth, before the first flyby of Atlas IIII. The same interval, the same stability, the same sense of precision that no natural body could maintain. The signal wasn't electromagnetic this time. It came through gravity. Tiny variations in the field between the two planets, like a whisper sent through mass instead of air. Sensitive instruments on Earth's surface began to detect minute shifts in local gravity, a kind of vibration in the planet's own inertia. It wasn't enough to move anything physically, but it could be measured, and it was everywhere. 61 seconds, a rhythm without a source. "We're resonating," Voss said. "Earth's matching the pulse." At the same time, Venus started to change again. Infrared telescopes picked up thermal anomalies beneath the cloud deck, isolated hotspots forming a symmetrical pattern along the equator. 6 of them, evenly spaced, each one expanding in perfect synchronization. From orbit, they looked like beads of light embedded in shadow. Every 61 seconds, all 6 brightened for exactly 1 second, then faded together, as if obeying a central command. It was a planetary heartbeat. The phenomenon drew attention across every space agency on Earth. Scientists speculated about volcanic activity, atmospheric lightning, ionization events, but none of it fit the data. The temperatures were too stable, the synchronization too perfect. And then came the breakthrough. One of the probes recorded faint electromagnetic feedback between the hotspots. Each pulse created interference at the same harmonic frequency. When analyzed together, the pattern resembled a waveform, a message written in heat. Voss stared at the image for several minutes before speaking. "It's the same geometry," she said. "The spiral. It's reforming." Inside Venus, something had reawakened. The resonance Atlas had left behind was reorganizing. The 6 hotspots acted like nodes, connection points of a larger structure. Between them, pressure waves formed a lattice pattern, curving inward toward an invisible center deep within the planet. The storm above them grew darker. Lightning began to cluster in hexagonal formations, each strike occurring exactly 61 seconds apart. No random discharge, no chaos, just rhythm. It was as if the entire planet had turned into a gigantic circuit, reassembling the memory of what it once contained. On Earth, the effects became impossible to ignore. Tidal sensors recorded unexplained oscillations in ocean levels, small, almost imperceptible rises and falls every 61 seconds. The cause wasn't lunar or atmospheric. It was coming from deep inside the gravitational link between Earth and Venus. Even satellite clocks began to drift, not by malfunction, but by synchronization. They started aligning their timing signals, not to Earth's standard atomic time, but to the intervals of the pulse itself. Machines were falling into rhythm with a frequency that came from somewhere else. Voss watched the phenomenon spread through the data networks. Power grids flickered in harmonic cycles. Seismographs caught faint, repeating tremors that didn't match any tectonic source. "It's not Venus talking to us," she said finally. "It's both planets talking to each other." The second pulse, as it was later called, wasn't destructive, at least not yet. It was delicate, steady, patient. The world didn't end. It simply vibrated. But those who studied the waveforms began to notice something new hidden inside the pulse. A faint delay, a subharmonic tone that seemed to listen back. It wasn't transmission, it was feedback. The pulse wasn't just being sent outward, it was responding to itself, as though the echo between the two planets was forming a closed loop. "It's self-sustaining now," Voss wrote in her journal. "A planetary conversation that doesn't need us anymore." Weeks passed. Venus continued to glow faintly in infrared, and the gravitational fluctuations stabilized into a predictable pattern. Astronomers tracked the changes in orbit, noting that the planet's rotation had subtly increased, by less than a second per day, but measurable. The energy was building somewhere. No one knew why. Then, on the 31st day of the second pulse, Venus brightened again. Not gradually this time, suddenly, violently, as though the planet had released a single burst of stored energy. For 61 seconds, it became brighter than any object in the night sky except the moon. Every radio antenna on Earth fell silent. GPS signals froze, compasses spun, and then, as quickly as it began, the light vanished. When data resumed, every instrument in the solar system recorded the same signature, a ripple of low-frequency gravity expanding outward from Venus, washing across space like a tide. It wasn't strong enough to cause damage, but it was coherent, structured, deliberate. A pulse from a world that had learned to reflect, now sending its reflection back into the dark. Voss watched the data resolve into a waveform. It looked almost identical to the original Atlas pulse. But there was something new, a slight phase shift, as if the echo had learned how to think. "That's not a reflection," she said. "That's a response." That night, she wrote her final note before the blackout that would follow. "Venus is awake. Atlas isn't an object anymore. It's a system, a bridge built from resonance and memory, and the second pulse is its first word." The sulfur choir. By the time the second pulse faded, the upper atmosphere of Venus was no longer chaos. It had structure, rhythm, density, even tone. The storms still spun, yes, but their motion was no longer random. Each current followed a curved trajectory that aligned perfectly with the planet's harmonic cycle. Winds that once screamed at 360 kilometers per hour now moved like breath, drawn through a vast instrument. The planet had become a resonator, and though it had no air we could breathe, it began to sing. It wasn't sound in the human sense. Venus's atmosphere was too dense, too hot, too thick for acoustic waves. But when translated into electromagnetic frequency, the signals revealed a deep harmonic resonance, a continuous oscillation between sulfur clouds and magnetic field. Each oscillation carried overtones, layered and complex, like a choir of tones too low for human hearing. The world had formed its own symphony, the sulfur choir. From orbit, probes recorded the strange vibrations as subtle distortions in light. Each pulse warped the way sunlight scattered through the haze. Instead of random diffusion, the light bent in repeating arcs, creating faint concentric halos visible only in ultraviolet. They formed, expanded, vanished, and then reappeared, always on the 61-second rhythm. For a brief moment, every cycle, the upper clouds became transparent, revealing flashes of metallic glimmer deep below. The planet seemed to breathe through light itself. Dr. Voss analyzed the recordings with growing disbelief. "These aren't natural," she murmured. "They're too stable. Each overtone has a perfect harmonic ratio, 4 to 3, 3 to 2, 5 to 4. It's music, not random resonance, constructed resonance." Her assistant frowned. "By whom? Atlas?" "Not anymore," she said. "By Venus itself." Within the atmosphere, chemical reactions began to synchronize with the oscillations. Sulfur dioxide molecules, when ionized by the electromagnetic pulses, formed temporary chains, microstructures that bent radiation into distinct wavelengths. To the senses, they looked like strings of luminous dust hanging in the sky. For brief instants, the entire upper atmosphere resembled a network of glowing filaments, each vibrating in perfect sync. It was as if the planet had turned its own toxic air into vocal cords. And through those cords, something moved, a modulation too intricate to be weather. Each frequency shift carried information, as though the resonance was both sound and syntax. Venus was not just resonating, it was communicating through its own chemistry. Earth's instruments picked up the effect days later. Low-frequency electromagnetic noise flooded deep space receivers, but beneath the interference, the pattern was unmistakable. A perfect harmonic ladder, each step aligning with the natural resonance frequencies of the planet. Voss recorded her thoughts in the quiet of the observatory. "Every world has a frequency," she said. "We've known that since Kepler, but this is articulation. It's not just harmony, it's intent." As Venus sang, the surrounding space changed. Charged particles drifting through its magnetosphere began to cluster, aligning along invisible lines. Auroral rings formed not around the poles, but along the equator, bands of greenish-white light that flickered rhythmically. Instruments detected faint pressure waves extending outward into interplanetary space, a chorus spreading through the void. The sulfur choir was no longer confined to the planet. It was reaching out. For the first time, astronomers noticed synchronization between Venus and Earth's ionosphere. Every 61 seconds, a faint electromagnetic pulse passed between the two worlds. It wasn't directional. It didn't carry energy. It was simply there, a heartbeat shared across millions of kilometers. Voss stared at the graphs, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're in phase. The two atmospheres are breathing together." By now, the entire scientific community was watching. News outlets spoke of planetary resonance and harmonic storms. To the public, it was another cosmic curiosity. To Voss, it was something else entirely. Venus isn't a body anymore, she told the camera during one of her final briefings. It's a mechanism, a living amplifier for whatever Atlas introduced. It's no longer reacting, it's composing. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the resonance shifted. The fundamental frequency dropped by half. The harmonics wavered. Sensors recorded interference across all channels. The orderly rhythm fractured into chaos. And within that chaos, something new emerged. A secondary tone. Deeper, heavier, resonating not in the atmosphere, but in the crust itself. Venus had found its next register. The ground beneath the clouds, molten plains of basalt and iron oxide, began to respond. Thermal images showed massive heat surges spreading across the surface, flowing in waves like breath through lungs. Each wave shimmered as it moved, reflecting the upper light like liquid metal. For the first time, the surface and the sky were moving in unison. A planetary duet. Dr. Voss leaned closer to the display, eyes fixed on the deep, harmonic trace, now pulsing through both atmospheric and geological layers. "It's evolving again," she said. "The song's not ending, it's changing register." The assistant hesitated. What happens when it reaches the core? Voss didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before. "Then we'll find out what it's been trying to remember." The Iron Horizon. The storms cleared for the first time in human observation. For decades, Venus had been nothing but a featureless veil, a smooth, opaque shroud of yellow clouds hiding everything beneath. Even the most powerful radars could only guess at what lay below. But now, in the wake of the sulfur choir, the veil had changed. The atmosphere thinned. The density gradients that once scattered light had organized into precise bands, and sunlight, real sunlight, began to filter through. It came down not as brightness, but as fire. Columns of gold and red light burning through the air like liquid glass. And for the first time, Venus had a horizon. The surface shimmered like a metal ocean. Infrared satellites captured it first, a plain of molten basalt reflecting radiation in long, rhythmic waves. The light wasn't natural reflection. It was coherent, directional, structured. Each shimmer corresponded to the atmospheric pulse above, as though the planet's skin had learned to echo the song of its sky. Then, between those rippling plains, the first anomaly appeared, a shadow. At first, it looked like a mountain, a small peak protruding through the molten terrain. But as instruments zoomed in, it shifted, its edges sharpened, its surface darkened until it absorbed the light around it. Voss recognized the geometry instantly. "Atlas," she said quietly. It surfaced again. The object didn't rise or fall. It simply was there. A motionless form in the middle of a sea of iron. Thermal readings showed it colder than its surroundings by hundreds of degrees, yet the air around it glowed faintly green, as if trying to imitate its memory. The team analyzed the light and discovered something extraordinary. The reflection from the molten plains wasn't scattering randomly. It was bending around Atlas, refracting in loops and spirals, as if the entire surface were a mirror reflecting the object's internal geometry outward. The Iron Horizon, that's what they called it. A landscape made of molten mirrors, each one reflecting something slightly different. And in those reflections, Atlas multiplied. The imagery from orbit showed hundreds of distorted silhouettes spread across the plane. Each one moved subtly out of sync with the real object, like shadows belonging to different moments in time. Some bent inward, Others rotated in reverse. The heat haze turned every reflection into motion, a choreography of light and gravity. "They're not illusions," Voss said. "They're phase echoes. Each reflection is a record of the object's earlier states." Her assistant frowned. "You mean time-lagged reflections?" "Exactly. The planet's surface is storing light the way memory stores thought." Then the surface began to move. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the molten mirror started to tilt. Not from wind, not from tremor, but as if responding to some internal shift. Across the horizon, reflections aligned, all of them pointing toward the same direction. Directly up, the mirrored plane focused the incoming sunlight into a single vertical column, a shaft of radiant heat that extended from the ground to the upper atmosphere. It wasn't just reflection anymore, it was projection. Venus had turned itself into a signal tower. The column of light pulsed, steady and deliberate. Each burst lasted 61 seconds, the same rhythm that had followed Atlas since its first detection near Earth. Every cycle grew brighter until the light became visible through the cloud tops. Astronomers on Earth saw it before the data reached them, a faint green line piercing through the haze, like a filament stretching towards space. To the naked eye, it looked like a storm's aftermath. To instruments, it was something else entirely, a coherent light source strong enough to scatter across interplanetary dust. "It's not radiating energy," said one researcher at ESA. "It's radiating structure." The iron horizon expanded outward. The molten plane cooled and hardened into reflective sheets. Vast, glass-like surfaces kilometers wide. Seismic data showed that the crust beneath them had stabilized. Where chaos once ruled, order was forming. The planet was literally reshaping itself into a mirror. But mirrors reflect everything, even what shouldn't be seen. As sunlight refracted through the new crystalline terrain, images began to appear that no one could explain. Satellite optics recorded faint shapes in the reflections, silhouettes of clouds, oceans, continents, but none of them matched Venus. They matched Earth. The implications sent shockwaves through every observatory on the planet. It wasn't a live reflection, it was memory. Venus was projecting the last thing it had seen through Atlas before the descent, the image of the blue world that had watched it. Voss stared at the screen in silence. Her face reflected the same pale light from the monitor, as though she too had become part of the projection. "It's remembering us," she said finally. "The whole planet is replaying the memory of its observer." Meanwhile, the reflection deepened. Infrared sensors picked up a second signature, not light, but magnetism. The pulse of the iron horizon wasn't just visual. Each flash was accompanied by a corresponding surge in the magnetic field. But instead of destabilizing, the field began to synchronize, forming perfect harmonic loops between the surface and atmosphere. Venus's magnetosphere, once weak and chaotic, was stabilizing for the first time in its history. "Resonance stabilization confirmed," said the technician. "Magnetic polarity is holding steady." Voss took a long breath. "It's balancing itself. It's learning equilibrium." The iron horizon kept pulsing for another hour, each cycle slightly dimmer than the last. The surface cooled further, and the molten reflection froze into black glass. The planet's glow faded back into its natural amber hue. But beneath the calm, a low, steady hum continued to vibrate across the spectrum, a sound too deep to hear, too constant to stop. Venus had found its voice, and that voice had settled into harmony. Voss closed her notebook. "It's done," she said, for now. But in the data feed, the final frame showed one last anomaly, a small, faint flare at the edge of the iron horizon. A pulse, red this time, shorter wavelength, stronger amplitude, not reflection, adaptation. The glass pulse. The first fragments appeared 12 hours after the iron horizon cooled. At first, the readings looked like sensor noise, faint spikes of reflectivity in the lower atmosphere, thin anomalies that didn't match any known cloud formation. Then, one of the orbital cameras caught it, a glint, a sudden flash beneath the sulfur haze. It wasn't lightning. It was too still, too defined, and when the light struck the probe's lens, it left a diffraction pattern, the kind only produced by crystalline surfaces. Something new was forming in the air. Dr. Voss stared at the data feed. "Crystallization," she said softly. "But that's impossible at those temperatures. At 460 degrees C, nothing should solidify. No mineral, no glass, no known compound could survive as a structure in that heat." Yet spectroscopy showed narrow reflective bands, not random scatter, but ordered diffraction. The light from the iron horizon had seeded the clouds with something stable. When the pulsars hit the sulfuric vapor, the molecules reacted not by burning, but by aligning. Chains of sulfur dioxide and metallic ions fused into tiny filaments of refractive glass, crystallized light suspended in air. The scientists called them lumen threads. From orbit, the effect was mesmerizing. Each 61-second cycle of the new red pulse from Atlas caused the upper clouds to shimmer with millions of points of light. They moved like dust, caught in slow motion, rising and falling in perfect synchrony. The atmosphere had turned into a living mirror, a sea of tiny prisms bending the sunlight into veins of color that pulsed with the same rhythm as the planet's heartbeat. It was no longer chaos. It was architecture. Voss recorded her thoughts quietly into her log. "The air is forming structure," she said. "It's like glass rain, self-organizing crystalline filaments. They're carrying the pulse upward, scattering light through density instead of distance. Venus is refracting itself." Soon, the phenomenon reached the upper atmosphere. From telescopes on Earth, Venus began to change color again. Its hue deepened, no longer yellow or gold, but something metallic. Observers described it as a copper sheen, with hints of emerald at the edges, like the reflection of light through tinted glass. Radio operators noticed increased interference whenever the planet crossed the horizon. The reason was simple. The atmosphere had become an enormous resonant crystal, reflecting electromagnetic waves in unpredictable ways. The planet wasn't just glowing anymore, it was transmitting. In the laboratories, simulation models began to fail. No known thermodynamic system could explain how ordered crystal structures could form in a superheated gas. But the key lay in the wavelength. The new red pulse emitted by Atlas had a strange property. It wasn't just energy. It carried modulation in amplitude and phase that caused resonance in specific molecular bonds. The radiation wasn't destructive. It was directive. It told matter how to arrange itself. Every 61 seconds, a standing wave of coherent energy passed through the air, freezing small regions into ordered arrays before they dissolved again. A rhythm of construction and decay, birth, death, and rebirth, all in a single breath. When the next probe entered the atmosphere, it didn't survive long. The heat destroyed its outer shell in minutes, but before its systems failed, it transmitted a few seconds of video. Through the distortion, shapes were visible. Sheets of floating crystal, some transparent, some tinted red, shifting and folding like sails in a windless sea. They didn't fall or rise. They drifted, perfectly balanced between gravity and pressure. The sun's light refracted through them, casting columns of color across the haze. The effect was hypnotic, almost peaceful. Then the feed cut to static. On Earth, Voss replayed those last frames over and over. The images were faint, but the motion was consistent. Each fragment of glass vibrated, and when enhanced in slow motion, the movement matched the harmonic pattern of Atlas's earlier emissions. "They're not debris," she said. "They're transmitters." The assistant hesitated. Transmitters of what? Structure, form, the pulse itself. Over the next days, the red light intensified. It was no longer a reflection from the iron horizon. It was radiation from within. The wavelength was measured at 730 nanometers, deep red, almost infrared, just beyond human vision. The same color emitted by cooling metal, the color of survival. Every time the pulse reached its peak, the crystals glowed from within, amplifying the light and scattering it upward until it reached the edge of the atmosphere. The glow was faintly visible from Earth as a halo, a soft red ring outlining the planet like the afterimage of a dying ember. Astronomers compared it to auroral activity, but the data told another story. The intensity of the glow wasn't decreasing. It was stabilizing, like a controlled feedback system. Venus had reached thermal balance, a self-regulating cycle. The planet was doing what no one thought possible, maintaining equilibrium between fire and reflection. "It's alive," Voss said quietly, "not biologically, but dynamically. It's found a way to keep itself intact." The glass rain continued. Each cycle released more filaments, which drifted down into the lower layers and eventually melted into the heat. But the memory of their structure remained, encoded in the electromagnetic field that spanned the atmosphere. The air itself was learning the shape of stability, and at the center of it all, Atlas still pulsed. Its light no longer white, no longer green, now deep crimson. A wavelength that cut through the sulfur haze like blood through smoke. The wavelength of endurance. By the time the last probe transmitted, the reflection from Venus had stabilized into a perfect pulse. Bright, dim, bright again, each one 61 seconds apart. Not just repetition, respiration. Voss wrote her final entry for the day. The planet has entered a closed cycle. Its storms have turned to glass, its light to rhythm. The air remembers its shape, and Atlas, it's not leaving, it's adapting. Resonance collapse. The balance didn't last. For weeks, Venus glowed in steady rhythm, its red pulse beating like a calm heart beneath the clouds. The storms had quieted, the planet's radiation stabilized, and Atlas appeared dormant. It was, for a brief moment, peace, a mechanical kind of serenity. Then, on the 43rd day of the pulse, the rhythm changed. It began with a delay, not a large one, only fractions of a second, but enough for instruments to notice. The 61-second cycle became 61.1, then 61.2. Something in the feedback was lagging behind. Venus had missed a breath. At first, the deviation looked like drift. Even Dr. Voss thought it might be normal. Thermal buildup, a phase shift, data corruption. But the delay grew with every pulse. The synchronization between the atmosphere and magnetic field broke down. The mirror effect that had once stabilized the planet now began to fracture. Spectrometers showed the once unified glow splitting into two distinct bands, one red, one white. The pulses came out of phase with each other, interfering instead of amplifying. It was resonance turning on itself. "We're watching constructive interference collapse," Voss said quietly, "the system's fighting itself." Inside the atmosphere, the crystals that had formed the luminous rain began to disintegrate. Their ordered lattice structure shattered under conflicting frequencies, releasing bursts of energy. Every 61 seconds, the upper layers of the atmosphere flared in flashes of ultraviolet light, not from heat, but from mechanical stress at the molecular level. Venus wasn't burning, it was screaming again. Magnetic readings went wild. The field that had briefly stabilized began to oscillate uncontrollably. North and south poles shifted positions every few hours, sometimes flipping entirely before reversing again. It wasn't geomagnetic reversal, it was instability. The planet's core, no longer in phase with its atmosphere, had lost alignment with the harmonic structure that Atlas maintained. And Atlas itself? It had started pulsing irregularly, its emissions scattering in unpredictable directions. "It's slipping out of sync," Voss said. "The object's rhythm no longer matches the planet's." She paused. "If it keeps diverging, it could tear the magnetic field apart." The next 24 hours confirmed it. The planet's magnetosphere began to collapse inward. Instead of protecting the atmosphere, it started pulling radiation into itself. Charged particles from the solar wind no longer deflected. They penetrated, interacting directly with the upper layers. The result was catastrophic. The glass clouds turned incandescent. The fragile, crystalline structures that had once reflected light now refracted it uncontrollably, creating internal lightning storms that lasted for hours. Venus had become a burning prism. To observers on Earth, it was breathtaking. The planet flared brighter than at any time since the Iron Horizon. Bands of light rippled across its surface like veins under molten skin. Red, gold, violet, then pure white. The beauty was unreal, the kind that only exists at the edge of destruction. But the instruments told the truth. The magnetic field was collapsing, and with it, the feedback loop that had given Venus its balance. "It's losing coherence," Voss whispered. "Entropy is reclaiming the structure." The collapse spread quickly. Within hours, the field fluctuations began generating secondary harmonics, ghost frequencies that resonated across interplanetary space. They weren't light or radiation. They were informational waves, variations in the gravitational field, like the fingerprints of energy patterns encoded into mass itself. Earth felt them first. Sensitive instruments detected tiny distortions in orbit, minute shifts in satellite positioning, unexplainable timing drifts, a faint hum in the background of every signal transmission. Nothing destructive, but unmistakable. The echo of Venus had reached the void. The media called it the whisper. No one could hear it, but its effects were measurable everywhere. Power grids fluctuated. Quantum clocks lost synchronization for exactly 61 milliseconds. Radio astronomers detected repeating signatures that looked like Morse code made of gravity. To Voss, it wasn't a mystery. It was communication, unintended, uncontrolled, a dying planet transmitting its own decay. "It's not sending a message," she said during a debrief. "It's broadcasting what it is. A record of collapse, a map of disintegration." Inside the Venusian clouds, the process accelerated. Magnetic compression forced plasma arcs to form above Atlas, each strike following no predictable path. The air ionized completely, turning the surrounding region into a vast, glowing storm of metallic vapor. From orbit, it looked like a giant ring of light encircling the equator, a luminous wound expanding in slow motion. The iron horizon beneath it fractured into hundreds of pieces. Each plate of once solid glass shattered, drifting upward in spirals of molten shards that reflected the light like diamonds. Venus was coming apart, but doing so beautifully. Then, abruptly, the emissions stopped. The light went out. The radio signals went flat. The gravitational oscillations vanished. For nearly an hour, the entire solar system seemed to exhale. And then, from the darkness, a single pulse, deep red, steady, clean. Atlas was still active. Every sensor confirmed it. The object had survived the collapse. But it wasn't emitting in the old spectrum anymore. Its wavelength had shifted deeper, into infrared, longer, slower, more deliberate. The wavelength of endurance, Voss whispered. It's adapting again. Venus's magnetic field, now weak and fragmented, reorganized around this new frequency. Instead of chaos, a faint order began to reappear. The resonance hadn't ended. It had evolved. The planet was learning to breathe differently. This isn't collapse, Voss said in her final note of the day. This is metamorphosis. The system has found a new rhythm, one too slow for us to hear. It's not dying. It's lowering its voice. The second breath. The silence after the collapse lasted longer than anyone expected. No flashes, no harmonics, no pulses. Venus became, once again, a dull ember in the solar sky, featureless, quiet, and opaque. But instruments continued to hum. Data kept coming in, faint but steady, and in that quiet rhythm, scientists began to notice something new. The planet's electromagnetic noise had changed. Where before there had been the erratic hiss of ion storms, now there was a slow, deliberate oscillation, longer than before, lower in frequency, like the drawn-out exhale of something vast returning to equilibrium. Venus had begun to breathe again. The new pulse came not from the atmosphere, but from the surface. The molten planes that had fractured during the resonance collapse were now glowing faintly in the infrared spectrum, emitting precise bursts of heat every 90 seconds. The timing was stable, regular, purposeful. It was a different rhythm, not the urgent 61 seconds of the Atlas cycle, but slower, deeper, as if the planet had learned to pace its own heartbeat. Dr. Voss watched the data scroll across the monitor. "It's alive in the thermal band," she whispered. "The pulse survived the collapse. It just changed mediums." Infrared telescopes confirmed it. From Earth, Venus now glowed with a subtle red hue, visible even in daylight through narrowband filters. The emission wasn't reflection or atmospheric scattering. It was direct thermal radiation. But its structure was extraordinary. The wavelengths were modulated, pulsing in intervals that corresponded perfectly to the new 90-second cycle. The planet was speaking in heat. Voss wrote in her notes, "This is no longer light, nor resonance. It's respiration. Atlas has integrated with the crust. It's not an intruder anymore, it's a system." At the same time, the planet's magnetosphere stabilized again, weak but coherent. Unlike before, it didn't fight the solar wind. Instead, it danced with it. The magnetic field began to oscillate in sync with the thermal pulses, creating a faint but measurable interaction with the sun's radiation. Every 90 seconds, Venus emitted a low-frequency electromagnetic surge toward the sun, and the solar wind replied, not instantly, but with a delay, as if the star itself were acknowledging the rhythm. For the first time in human history, two celestial bodies were communicating through temperature and field. The effect extended far beyond Venus. Solar observatories recorded subtle fluctuations in the corona's density, timed perfectly to the planet's new pulse. The synchronization spread like ripples through the heliosphere. Tiny changes appeared in solar wind velocity at Earth's orbit, followed by brief electromagnetic fluctuations in our upper atmosphere. The planet that once screamed in chaos was now humming in harmony with its star. Voss stared at the graphs, unable to speak for a long time. Finally, she whispered, "It found the wavelength of survival. It's breathing with the sun." The transformation of Atlas itself was harder to detect. By this point, radar imaging showed nothing of the original object. The black geometry that once hovered like a monolith had dissolved completely into the surface, but the thermal data betrayed its presence. At the equator, near the coordinates of the iron horizon, there was a heat anomaly, a circular region exactly 61 kilometers wide, emitting steady infrared radiation in perfect synchronization with the global pulse. No structure, no edges, no motion, just a smooth, uniform glow. "It's melted into the planet," Voss said. "Not destroyed, absorbed." The implications were staggering. Venus had done what no world should be able to do: take an external object, assimilate it, and reorganize itself around its energy. The temperature across the lower atmosphere began to fall, not drastically, but measurably, from 460 degrees to 420 degrees C in a matter of days. The thick clouds of sulfur dioxide thinned, and spectrometers picked up trace amounts of water vapor for the first time in years. It wasn't rain, not yet, but it was potential. Venus was cooling. The scientists debated endlessly. Was this stability, or merely another stage of collapse? Was Atlas adapting or retreating? To Voss, it didn't matter. The pattern was too deliberate, too consistent. She looked at the data and saw not chaos, but intelligence. Not sentience, perhaps, but instinct. Something in the system was choosing to preserve itself. "The object has changed its survival strategy," she said in a private message to ESA. "It's no longer reflecting energy outward. It's turning it inward. It's conserving." As the days passed, the pulses grew softer, their amplitude fading to near silence. But the pattern never broke. Each 90-second breath carried less energy, as though the planet were falling asleep. And yet, even in that sleep, it continued to emit heat, steady, rhythmic, alive. When the last transmission came through, Dr. Voss stood by the window of her observatory, watching the faint red shimmer of Venus low on the horizon. The world that had once burned too brightly to reflect anything now glowed like a coal at the edge of extinction. "It didn't die," she said softly. "It adapted to survive its own memory." In her final entry, she wrote, "The first breath destroyed. The second breath endured. Every world must find its rhythm to live." For Venus, it was not light that saved it, but warmth, the smallest whisper of equilibrium in an ocean of fire. She paused before adding one last line. "Atlas 3I has left the light behind. It has become the breath of the planet itself." And then, days later, a faint transmission arrived from deep space telemetry. Venus's infrared emissions had shifted again, their frequency slowly drifting toward the sun. The planet's pulse was realigning with its orbit, and a secondary wave, weaker, colder, was moving away, out of the atmosphere, back into space. Voss stared at the report and whispered the inevitable, "It's leaving again." The unforgiving sky, echoes in the static. It began, as it always did, with a pulse. Not visible this time, not luminous or majestic, but quiet, hidden in the noise between signals where machines hum and humans no longer listen. At 2:19 UTC, a low-frequency distortion appeared across every deep space network monitoring Venus. At first, it was dismissed as interference from solar activity, a magnetic burp from the sun's restless corona. But within hours, the pattern repeated, perfectly timed, 61 seconds. The number returned. Dr. Voss had been expecting it, though she never admitted it aloud. Even after the second breath, after Venus had cooled and seemingly stabilized, she had kept her receivers active. She had written in one of her unpublished notes, "If Atlas learned to breathe, it will one day learn to speak." And now it had. But the voice was not the one she remembered. The pulses were inverted, their peaks and troughs reversed, their harmonics warped backward in phase. To the instruments, they appeared as negative resonance, a pattern that seemed to consume rather than emit. The rhythm was the same, but its direction had changed. Spectrograms revealed something stranger. Each pulse contained minute fluctuations that shouldn't exist, microscopic noise bursts too precise to be random. When processed, they formed repeating wavelets, a perfect mirrored version of the original Atlas signal from the Earth flyby months before. It was as if the signal had been recorded, inverted, and now sent back across space, not as an echo, but as a reversal. "It's talking in playback," said one of the analysts at ESA, "not repeating, remembering." Voss didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the monitor, watching the rising wave flatten into a line and then flare again, each time weaker, each time colder. "It's not memory," she said finally. "It's resistance." Over the next 48 hours, the reversed pulses intensified. Earth's magnetosphere began to hum faintly in their rhythm, as if the two planets were locked in a quiet argument across the void. The 61-second interval never changed, but the amplitude fluctuated wildly, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, like breathing interrupted by panic. The strange thing was how localized the effect became. Receivers on the night side of Earth detected the pulses first. Then, as the planet rotated, the signal migrated. From Chile to Europe, from Europe to Siberia, then to the Pacific. It moved in sync with the rotation of Venus itself. Voss wrote in her log, "The reflection has learned direction. It follows the light." But there was something else, something quieter, more disturbing. Within the static between the pulses, small, almost imperceptible patterns appeared. At first, they looked like noise artifacts, the random errors of radio systems strained by deep space distance. Then, when overlaid and looped, they formed coherent interference tones. Those tones, when transposed into audible frequencies, produced a strange effect, a sequence of low, dissonant hums that seemed to shift just as the human brain tried to identify them. Not melody, not voice, but intention. A rhythm that wasn't mechanical, it was aware. When the first audio reconstruction was played at the observatory, the team fell silent. The sound filled the room like a heavy fog, not loud, but suffocating. It had the texture of something that should not be heard, like metal flexing underwater, like breath caught in a machine. "It's not just a signal," whispered the technician. "It's an imitation." Voss nodded slowly. "A mirror can only reflect, but this one has learned to distort." The following night, new anomalies appeared. Deep space telescopes tracking Venus's emissions detected faint traces of polarization inversion, light bending backward against its own trajectory. Each time the inverted pulse reached Earth, the planet's upper ionosphere flickered slightly, as though touched by invisible static. It wasn't dangerous, but it was unnatural. Radio operators across Europe reported sudden interference every 61 seconds, just a brief flicker, like a heartbeat in the airwaves. Commercial pilots noticed strange oscillations in radar altimeters, then nothing at all. The effect came and went like a whisper. "The reflection's not coming from Venus anymore," Voss said quietly to her team. "It's passing through us." The realization came slowly, but it was undeniable. Venus wasn't merely transmitting, it was projecting the reflection through interplanetary space. And the reflection wasn't light or heat, it was data encoded in gravity and magnetic distortion. Each pulse carried traces of the original Atlas signal, but rearranged, inverted, and rewritten. It was no longer communication between planets. It was something else, a closed feedback loop that now included Earth. Over the next days, global observatories began reporting strange telemetry failures. Satellites orbiting near Venus lost their orientation sensors, then went dark. Others, near Earth, experienced time drift. Their atomic clocks began to lag, not randomly, but precisely 61 milliseconds behind UTC. The echo had become recursive. "We're no longer observing the reflection," Voss said into her recorder. "We're inside it." By the fifth day, the static grew thicker. The clean signals that once mapped Venus's calm pulse were now buried under layers of noise. But even that noise had structure, a subtle rhythm hidden inside the chaos, as though the system had learned to hide its own order. Voss played back the filtered spectrum again and again. Her computer rendered the signal as a waveform on the screen, and she realized the distortion wasn't random after all. Each inverted pulse carried a ghost, a faint secondary echo, delayed by less than a second. When amplified, it revealed a familiar pattern, the original Atlas frequency from its first encounter with Earth. The reflection had come full circle. The pulse that once left our world had now returned, inverted, mirrored, rewritten. As if Venus had taken our light, studied it, and sent back what it had learned. "Echoes in the static," Voss whispered, "but not our echoes anymore." The silence of Dr. Voss. At 0407 UTC, the observatory fell quiet. The hum of the receivers, once constant, comforting, stuttered, flickered, and then died. Only the faint crackle of residual current filled the silence, like static trapped in an empty room. Dr. Voss sat alone beneath the dim red glow of emergency lights, her face pale in the reflection of the monitor. The screens still showed signal traces, frozen in their last moment of coherence. A jagged waveform cut off mid-pulse, like a voice silenced mid-word. Outside, the night was clear. Venus hung low above the horizon, no brighter than usual, but its presence was unmistakable. An ember, hanging in the dark, watching. The failure had come gradually. First, one of the low-band antennas overloaded. Then another. Then the entire array began to desynchronize, its data streams slipping out of phase by exact multiples of 61 seconds. It wasn't random failure, it was mimicry. Each instrument was reproducing the same rhythmic distortion that had originated from Venus, not detecting it, but becoming it. It's not just sending signals anymore, Voss murmured into her recorder. It's rewriting the receivers. When the first sparks appeared on the main control panel, she didn't flinch. The smell of ozone filled the air as capacitors popped and the screens dimmed one by one, each fading in sync with the pulses that now came from inside the equipment itself. The signal wasn't entering through the antennas anymore. It was inducing within the circuits, the same way magnetic resonance can make a wire hum when it remembers the right frequency. For every 61-second cycle, the observatory's walls groaned with a faint vibration, barely audible, but felt through the bones. It was the rhythm of something vast, pressing against the edges of matter. Voss switched to backup power, then to the auxiliary recorders, old analog units sealed in lead housings for calibration tests. She knew they couldn't transmit, but they could capture. The data came in thick and fractured, jagged bursts of amplitude buried beneath static. She filtered, layered, slowed it down. And in the middle of that digital snow, she heard something that made her stop breathing. A voice. Not words, not speech, but rhythm. The slow, deliberate cadence of articulation. It wasn't imitation of language, it was learning the shape of it. The voice wasn't coming from space, it came from within the receiver room. Each piece of equipment, the monitors, the servers, even the air conditioning vents, vibrated subtly in resonance. The frequency wasn't sound, it was subsonic pressure, a deep trembling that resonated through glass and steel. The lights flickered, the data stream blinked. And then, through the speakers, the static broke for just 1 second, a single burst of coherent tone. Not light, not fire, just presence. She turned on her recorder again, her voice calm, steady, almost detached. This is Dr. Eleanor Voss, Station 6. The Venus transmission has inverted its polarity and replicated itself across our instruments. It's not reflection anymore, it's internalization. The signal is recursive. She paused. The hum in the room deepened. Every metal surface began to shimmer, faintly with electrical corona. It's learning, she said softly, but it's not us anymore. The next minute of the recording is silence. Not static, not noise. Pure, perfect silence. Every piece of equipment at the observatory ceased operation at once. No explosion, no power surge, just instantaneous stillness. The emergency systems kicked in automatically, and the main relay transmitted one final data packet before failing completely. The file was corrupted, but its checksum confirmed a timestamp, exactly 61 seconds after her final words. By dawn, the facility was dark. The emergency generators had drained, and frost had begun to form on the inside of the observation windows, an impossibility in that climate. When a maintenance crew arrived 2 days later, they found no structural damage, no signs of fire, no signs of struggle. Every electronic system in the building was dead. Every capacitor discharged. Every hard drive magnetized into unreadable gray. The analog recorders, the ones she used last, were intact but empty. The tape had recorded nothing but 61 minutes of perfect silence. Yet, in the archives of the Deep Space Network, a fragment remained. It was faint, buried inside noise from the failed data relay, but unmistakable. A single tone at 7.3 terahertz, identical to the last frequency emitted by Atlas before its descent into Venus. The tone lasted exactly 1 second, then nothing. No one ever heard from Dr. Voss again. For weeks, The observatory's signal remained dead. Then, at precisely the same hour of her disappearance, the main satellite dish rotated on its own, slowly, precisely to face Venus. The motors were unpowered, the controls were offline, but the dish moved, and for 61 seconds it held its aim. Then it stopped. At that same moment, space telescopes caught something new on the surface of Venus, a faint glimmer just above the equator, a small rhythmic pulse of light, barely visible through the haze. It blinked once every minute, exactly in sync with the timing of Dr. Voss's last transmission. A signal, not from Earth, not from Atlas, but from something between them. The red mirror. For 3 nights, Venus burned, not with sunlight, not with reflected flame, but with something deeper, a slow, pulsing glow that came from beneath the clouds, like the planet itself had turned translucent from within. No observatory on Earth was ready for it. After weeks of silence, the world had begun to forget. Dr. Voss's final transmission had been archived, classified, absorbed into the endless churn of other mysteries. But when the glow appeared, the night sky remembered her name. At first, it looked like an atmospheric flare, a pale blush along the planet's rim, barely perceptible even through telescopes. But by midnight, the hue deepened, shifting from ochre to crimson until Venus shone like an ember through fog. For those watching from the ground, it wasn't light in the ordinary sense. It didn't cast shadows. It didn't sparkle or waver. It simply was, a presence more than a sight, a light that felt remembered rather than seen. The first clear images came from the Atacama Array. High-resolution thermal scans revealed concentric rings spreading outward from the equator, each one radiating in perfect synchronization with the old 61-second rhythm. They weren't reflections or storms, they were structured, as if the planet's surface had hardened into translucent layers of heat, each pulsing in time. The scientists called it the red mirror. It wasn't an eruption, it was projection. Venus wasn't emitting light. It was reflecting the memory of it. Spectral analysis confirmed the impossible. The radiation was coherent. Every wavelength matched the thermal signature of the last known Atlas emission, but mirrored, its polarity reversed. Instead of outward energy, it was inward reflection. The planet wasn't radiating heat into space, it was pulling light back into itself. "It's inverted," said one researcher at ESA. "The planet's reflecting light in reverse phase. It's reabsorbing photons." Voss's assistant, one of the few survivors from her original team, read the reports in silence. He recognized the frequency. It was the same as the tone that had ended her transmission. Night 2 brought escalation. The red mirror expanded until it covered the entire visible hemisphere. The pulsing grew faster, the rhythm tightening from 61 seconds to 58, then 56. It was as though the planet was accelerating through its own reflection, each cycle feeding the next. Amateur astronomers across the world began to record it. The internet filled with shaky videos, a faint, trembling red sphere hovering beside the moon. Most dismissed it as lens flare or atmospheric distortion, but those who tracked it carefully noticed something chilling. The glow wasn't uniform. It flickered in patterns, wave-like modulations that resembled the pulse of a heartbeat. On the third night, the phenomenon reached its peak. From orbit, Venus no longer looked like a planet. It was a mirror turned outward, a perfect, crimson disk reflecting something that wasn't there. Solar radiation scattered off it in impossible directions, bending light around its edges, forming halos that broke every known law of optics. The cameras on the Magellan Relay captured the most haunting image, a circular flash that spread outward from the equator, then folded back in, as if the planet had blinked. When the frame was stabilized and enhanced, the surface reflection revealed faint geometric patterns, spirals, intersecting arcs, lattices of light that no weather system could form. And within those patterns, a familiar outline, the transmission signature of Dr. Voss's observatory. It wasn't random. Venus was remembering her. For a few brief hours, the entire world turned its eyes toward the red horizon. News anchors spoke of planetary resonance, thermal feedback, and possible afterglow from Atlas. But the tone of their voices betrayed them. They were afraid, because no one could explain why the pulses were growing closer together. By 0300 UTC, the interval had dropped to 51 seconds, then 50, then 49. Something was winding up. When the red mirror reached its final intensity, the radiation ceased to behave like heat. Instead, it began modulating radio frequencies in orbit. Every deep space satellite started receiving short bursts of encoded data, incomplete, fragmented, but repeating. A team at JAXA decoded the first fragment within hours. It wasn't a signal from Venus itself, but from the space between Earth and Venus, a residual field of reflected radiation. Inside that field, one phrase appeared, repeated endlessly in binary phase code: not light, memory. The message looped for 20 minutes, then vanished. All instruments pointed at Venus went dark simultaneously. Thermal signatures dropped to zero. Optical readings flatlined. Even radar echoes disappeared, as though the planet had become completely opaque. Telescopes stared at the void where Venus had been, but found nothing. Not cloud, not light, not reflection. Just blackness. The red mirror had gone dark. On the final recorded image, Venus appeared half illuminated by sunlight, its upper atmosphere gleaming faintly. But in the last frame, captured milliseconds before the blackout, a strange distortion rippled across its surface, a shadow moving against the planet's curvature. It wasn't an atmospheric current. It was shape, a silhouette forming from within, as if something beneath the crust had turned to face the stars. Not light, memory. The phrase lingered in every observatory's database, buried deep within static, repeating at irregular intervals, like the echo of a voice through time delay. For the first time, Earth wasn't just receiving the reflection, it was hearing the memory. The message beneath. The red mirror had gone dark, but silence, as the scientists soon learned, is never empty. When Venus vanished behind its own shroud, every observatory across the planet turned inward, not out of curiosity, but dread. The data that had stopped coming through visible light had begun to whisper through background noise. It wasn't light anymore. It was code. At first, no one noticed it. The readings appeared as residual system chatter, tiny fluctuations in cosmic microwave background data, the kind of low-level noise every observatory learns to ignore. But the fluctuations were rhythmic. They rose and fell in waves, perfectly spaced at 61-second intervals. And within that pattern, the noise began to change shape. Spectral analysis showed harmonic groupings, clusters of frequencies stacked in layers like chords, as if the static itself had learned to sing, not in melody, but in memory. "It's the same frequency band we lost from Venus," said a voice over the transmission link. "But it's not coming from there anymore. It's in the noise." At NASA's Deep Space Network in Madrid, An analyst named Mendez discovered the first fragment. It was buried in the carrier signal of a defunct satellite, a low-priority communications probe that hadn't transmitted in years. Yet somehow, its inactive frequency had come alive again, carrying faint phase shifts encoded into its telemetry. The pattern repeated endlessly, slowly adjusting itself with each iteration, as if refining its own translation. When the interference was filtered through binary phase decoding, the result appeared on the screen as text, a single crystalline phrase, "not light, memory." No one understood what it meant. Some believed it was a malfunction, a recursive ghost created by corrupted software. Others thought it was a fragment of the Atlas reflection itself, a final echo bouncing endlessly between Earth and Venus. But when they compared the signal from multiple observatories, they found something terrifying. The phrase wasn't identical. Each copy contained small variations, changes in amplitude, micro fluctuations in phase alignment. When those variations were mapped, they formed spectral graphs. And those graphs weren't random. They were maps of radio beacons on Earth. Every transmission tower, every satellite dish, every receiver that had ever recorded the Venus pulse, its frequency signature was now embedded in the message. It was as though the reflection had catalogued every ear that had listened to it, and was now sending that information back, not as data, but as memory. "It's replaying us," said Mendez. "It's remembering the act of being watched." In Geneva, a team from CERN fed the decoded signal into a waveform visualizer, hoping to extract clearer data. What they saw instead was an image, faint, flickering, composed of interference lines that formed patterns over time. It wasn't a planet, it wasn't a star. It was a field of overlapping shapes, like ripples on the surface of an unseen ocean. Each ripple carried traces of the Atlas pulse, but distorted, multiplied, inverted. The image seemed to breathe, pulsing with the same slow rhythm that now haunted every listening station on Earth. "It's not a transmission," one physicist whispered. "It's a reflection of observation itself." Meanwhile, across the world, unshielded electronics began to hum. Shortwave radios picked up low, modulating tones. Even disconnected speakers emitted faint static bursts, as though responding to a frequency too subtle for circuits to resist. Some claimed to hear whispers in the noise, words half-formed, phrases repeating under breath. But whenever the signals were recorded and replayed, the voices vanished. Only the phrase remained. "Not light, memory." At the same time, strange visual phenomena began appearing in the upper atmosphere. Photometers over Chile and Hawaii detected faint, transient glows in the sky, lasting less than a second, invisible to the naked eye, but visible in infrared. Each flash occurred exactly when a Venus pulse reached Earth's orbit. But these weren't normal auroras or solar interactions. Their geometry was wrong. They appeared as perfect circles, flat, expanding rings of heat in the high stratosphere, each one the same diameter as the signal delay between the two planets, as if the air itself were catching echoes of invisible radiation. The sky had become a screen for memory. Governments went silent. Public networks filtered the data, but the scientists continued in private, decoding what they could, frame by frame, until they realized the signal wasn't simply a message. It was recursive, each iteration feeding back into itself, rewriting its structure over time. The system was learning. Every version of not light memory carried more complexity, more entropy compressed into fewer bits. The reflection was no longer static, it was evolving. "This isn't communication," Mendez said during a secure call. "It's transcription. Something is copying the process of remembering and over until memory becomes the only form of existence left." In the final analysis, one more anomaly surfaced. Each version of the message contained an extra data fragment, a subtle watermark, invisible in plain decoding, but revealed when filtered through the old Atlas frequency spectrum. The pattern repeated at the exact coordinates of Dr. Voss's observatory. Not random interference, not static, a signature, her signature, Voss E log 6. The name appeared in pure binary, encoded in the phase structure of the signal. Somewhere in the recursion, her instruments had survived or been remembered. Her presence had been written into the reflection itself. That was when the world stopped pretending it understood what was happening. It was no longer a scientific anomaly. It was a mirror, not of planets, but of consciousness. Venus wasn't shining, it was recalling. It had seen us, and now it was showing us what it had kept. And if light was no longer escaping, if every reflection folded inward into memory, then maybe, somewhere within that crimson darkness, the planet wasn't gone at all. It was still thinking. Not light, memory. The phrase repeated across the network one last time. And then, for exactly 61 hours, Venus vanished from every telescope on Earth. The sky was no longer forgiving. The day the sky turned black, it began without warning. One moment, Venus shimmered faintly in the early morning sky, a dim ember on the edge of dawn. The next, it was gone. Not eclipsed, not hidden. Gone. Every telescope on Earth, from amateur backyard instruments to the Keck array, lost its visual lock at precisely 0300 UTC. Infrared sensors went blind. Radar sweeps returned nothing but silence. Even gravitational telemetry, the faint tug that marks every planet's presence, flattened into statistical noise. For the first time in recorded history, an entire world had vanished from measurable reality. At first, the disappearance was dismissed as an observational error, solar interference, calibration failure, a data misalignment. But within hours, confirmation arrived from independent observatories across 3 continents. Venus was not reflecting light, it was not emitting heat. Its albedo, the measure of how much sunlight a planet returns, had fallen to 0. The second planet from the Sun had gone black. The scientists called it the Event Horizon Phenomenon. Though no one dared use the word black hole, Venus still occupied its orbit. Its mass was intact. But light, in every measurable sense, no longer acknowledged it. It wasn't that Venus absorbed energy, it ignored it. Photons struck its surface and failed to return. Waves entered and did not emerge. The laws of reflection had ceased to apply. "It's not physical," said Mendez during a global broadcast. "It's cognitive. The planet has become an event of memory, not matter." For 61 hours, a symbolic echo, a final repetition of the number that haunted every stage of the Atlas encounter, the solar system held its breath. During that time, subtle effects rippled outward. The solar wind curved around the invisible sphere, as though meeting resistance from something that wasn't there. Microwave radiation from the sun bent slightly off course, and deep space instruments recorded faint distortions in quantum field variance, small, localized gaps in probability itself. Where Venus should have been, reality thinned. On Earth, the effects were quieter, but no less disturbing. The night sky changed color. Without Venus's reflected glow, the gradient of twilight deepened unnaturally, a void where warmth should have been. For astronomers, it was simply absence. For others, it was something else, a feeling. Pilots reported a strange stillness at high altitude, a sensation that the air itself had become heavier. Radio operators described faint aftertones beneath the static, like echoes of voices repeating the same short phrase, "Not light, memory." On the second night, the temperature in the upper atmosphere dropped by 0.5 degrees, minor but measurable, as though the sun had momentarily forgotten a fragment of its warmth. Somewhere between the orbits of Mercury and Earth, something was changing how energy moved. The red mirror had closed, but what replaced it was worse. Venus had become a hole in perception. Meanwhile, deep space observatories still attempted contact. They sent bursts of microwave energy, encoded in mathematical primes, a universal signal of intelligence. Nothing returned. Then, precisely at the 47th hour, a pulse arrived. It wasn't electromagnetic, and it wasn't gravity, it was something else. A localized fluctuation in the quantum background field, detected simultaneously by 3 separate instruments. Its frequency, 7.3 terahertz, the same as the last tone recorded at Dr. Voss's observatory. When decoded into amplitude visualization, the waveform resembled a human voice, distorted, incomplete. But one phrase could be heard clearly, buried beneath the static. "It's learning." Then silence. At hour 58, the blackness began to move. Not the planet itself, the dark. It pulsed. Every minute, the invisible sphere dimmed further, then flared briefly in infrared, like a heart contracting after death. Each flare spread across interplanetary space, leaving faint ripples in electromagnetic telemetry. The solar system had gained a second heartbeat. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. At exactly hour 61, Venus reappeared. The planet blinked back into existence, not gradually, but instantly, as if someone had turned the sky back on. Its brightness was lower than before, its atmosphere darker, thicker, and its albedo, once among the highest of all planets, had dropped to less than half. Venus no longer reflected sunlight the way it once had. Its skin had changed. It had swallowed its reflection. Spectral scans confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The radiation signature of Atlas, the geometric pulse, the harmonic frequency, the living resonance that had haunted both planets, was gone. Not erased, integrated. Atlas was no longer distinguishable from Venus itself. The two had become one body, a single, unified system of memory and matter, a planet that no longer reflected the universe, but remembered it. "The reflection has collapsed," said Mendez during his final broadcast. "Venus is no longer a mirror, it's a recording." In the weeks that followed, the planet's rotation slowed by a measurable fraction of a degree per day. Its atmosphere thickened, its heat signature steadied, and then quietly, Venus began to hum again, a faint, rhythmic pulse, not 61 seconds this time, but 90, the same breath that once saved it. The second breath, echoing now through a darker sky. Dr. Voss's name was never spoken publicly again. Her work was sealed under international classification, but her final words, recovered from backup logs in a remote ESA server, were quietly published by one anonymous scientist. The message contained no data, no coordinates, no explanation. Just one sentence. It didn't destroy us. It only changed the air we breathe. Venus remained visible in the morning sky, but it never shone as it once did. Its beauty had turned opaque, a world that no longer gave light back, but kept it, like memory refusing to fade. And for the first time, astronomers began to wonder, if a planet can remember, what else in the cosmos might someday choose to forget? The Forgotten Horizon. Afterlight. It began with the sound of nothing. For days after Venus's return, the skies above Earth seemed unchanged, blue, calm, indifferent. But the silence beneath that calm was unnatural. Every monitoring station, every satellite array, every high-frequency antenna noticed it first. The background hum of the solar system, the constant static of charged particles and cosmic dust, had dimmed. The sun still burned. The stars still flickered. But something, some frequency that had always been there, was gone, as if the space between planets had exhaled. The first atmospheric anomalies appeared 3 days later. At the equator, radio telescopes detected faint tremors in the ionosphere, oscillations too soft to classify as geomagnetic storms, but too regular to dismiss as noise. Every 61 minutes, the upper layers of the atmosphere vibrated. A ripple, slow, low, harmonic, no visible light, no aurora, just a tremor, like the echo of a word no one could remember. "It's a shadow frequency," said Mendez in his final public address. "Something that used to connect us is gone, and what remains is only the absence of it." He was right. The link between Earth and Venus had broken. The bridge of reflection, the echo of memory that had tied the two worlds together, had dissolved, but its shape remained, like an imprint burned into space. Astronomers called it the afterlight, not because it shone, but because it lingered, a faint, ghostly band of radiation stretching between the orbits of Venus and Earth. It wasn't visible in optical wavelengths, but instruments tuned to certain frequencies could feel it, a quiet static that hummed at the edge of perception. Its rhythm wasn't constant. Sometimes it followed the Venusian pulse. Other times, it beat faintly in sync with the Earth's rotation, as though the two worlds were still speaking, but through the memory of a language they no longer shared. High above the stratosphere, weather balloons reported strange temperature inversions, zones where heat rose instead of falling. The air itself had begun to change texture. In some regions, sound carried differently, voices echoing too long, the wind falling silent mid-breath. Airplanes flying through these zones experienced a subtle, disorienting drift. Compasses twitched, instrumentation lagged. The pilots described the experience in the same word: weightless, as if the sky had forgotten it was supposed to hold them. In the weeks that followed, the global magnetic field fluctuated. Tiny, localized distortions appeared at intervals, circular regions of altered polarity that moved across the atmosphere like invisible storms. They weren't strong enough to disrupt power grids, but they interfered with satellites. Some lost telemetry entirely for 61 minutes, then came back as if nothing had happened. But the logs told another story. Each time a satellite blacked out, its onboard sensors recorded the same anomaly: a faint, repeating radio signal, originating from within the blackout zone. The signal matched the old Venus frequency, 7.3 terahertz, but shifted by half a phase, a mirror of a mirror. When mapped, the interference formed an unexpected pattern. The blackout zones weren't random. They moved in sync with Earth's rotation, tracing a perfect wave that circled the planet every 24 hours. The pulse was gone, but its absence still moved, a negative echo, a ghost of connection. It was as though the space between the two worlds still remembered being linked and continued to act out that memory in silence. One night, an aurora appeared over the Pacific. It wasn't green or red, but pale gold, thin, soft, like the reflection of candlelight on glass. It shimmered soundlessly for exactly 61 minutes. Then it vanished, leaving the sky blank and black again. The next morning, the instruments confirmed what no one wanted to say aloud. Venus had gone completely radio dead. No pulses, no thermal readings, no magnetic resonance, nothing. The connection was severed. And yet, Earth continued to hum. The atmosphere still vibrated at its faint intervals. The afterlight still shimmered in invisible bands above the stratosphere. Every hour, a pulse too soft for the ear but too precise for coincidence passed through the planet's magnetic field, a memory repeating itself, refusing to fade. "It's not the planet that remembers," Mendez wrote in his final note. "It's the space between them." He was right again. Venus had gone dark, but its absence still shone. As weeks turned into months, the afterlight began to fade. One by one, the invisible frequencies dropped below detection thresholds. The tremors ceased. The atmosphere stilled. The silence that followed was not peace, it was amnesia. The solar system had forgotten something fundamental, a rhythm that once tied light and thought together. And for the first time, Earth felt alone. Voss's hypothesis. The world had already begun to move on. Venus was quiet, Earth was safe, and space, once again, seemed distant, a black canvas with no pulse beneath it. But not everyone could forget. Months after her disappearance, a collection of handwritten notes and encrypted data fragments surfaced from a private archive in Geneva. The files were traced back to Dr. Eleanor Voss. Most were labeled simply hypothesis. No dates, no recipients, just one continuous stream of thought, as if she'd written them for something that wasn't human. "If Atlas is not an object," the first entry read, "then it is an event. Not a body moving through space, but a behavior that space itself performs." The phrasing was unusual, even for Voss. Her tone was calm, stripped of all human warmth, a scientist writing as if addressing the cosmos directly. Her next entry elaborated, "We assumed reflection to be communication, that the pulse meant hello, but what if it was a rehearsal, not for contact, but for forgetting?" She described the Atlas frequency not as a transmission, but as a form of cognitive entropy, a pattern that consumed information in order to stabilize energy. Where humanity sought memory as preservation, Atlas sought memory as decay. "Memory creates imbalance," she wrote. "Stars remember heat, planets remember impact, life remembers fear. Atlas corrects this by teaching matter to forget what it has endured." In one entry marked "After the Descent," Voss described a realization that came during the last hours before contact was lost. "Venus was not destroyed," she wrote. "It was rewritten. Its surface did not burn. It was cleared. The sulfur clouds, the iron plains, even the magnetosphere, they were records, layers of a long planetary trauma. Atlas stripped them away, like deleting corrupted code." Her handwriting grew uneven toward the end of that page. The next line was almost illegible. "It wasn't teaching us how to remember. It was teaching the cosmos how to forget. At first glance, the phrase sounded poetic, maybe even delusional. But when her data logs were cross-referenced with the Venusian telemetry, something uncanny emerged. In the final 61 seconds of recorded signal, the same window during which her observatory went silent, the magnetic flux readings showed negative entropy flow. Instead of increasing disorder, the system had briefly reversed it. The data suggested that, for one impossible moment, the atmosphere of Venus had become more ordered after the collapse. Energy had not been lost, it had been erased. The system performed subtraction, her notes said, not of matter, but of memory. Her final recovered document, titled simply The Law of Forgetting, was the most haunting. It began with an equation, a sequence of decaying harmonics corresponding to the 7.3 terahertz frequency of the Atlas pulse. Each cycle halved in amplitude until it vanished completely. Next to the formula, Voss had written a single sentence: "The end state of memory is stillness." She described a hypothetical model of the universe where remembrance was a temporary aberration, a side effect of entropy itself. In her view, Atlas represented a natural correction mechanism, an algorithm that moved through existence, erasing excess reflection. Forgetting, she wrote, is not failure, it is balance restored. Her last entry was personal. Unlike the others, it was not written for anyone, but for herself, a confession framed in perfect scientific detachment. When the light reflected from Atlas struck my instruments, I understood it wasn't showing us the future or the past. It was showing us how fragile recollection is. Every photon that remembers where it's been keeps the universe from resting. She paused, then added, "Perhaps that's why we fear oblivion, because we mistake peace for loss." When Mendez presented her findings to the International Astronomical Assembly, the room fell silent. Not because they dismissed her conclusions, but because they didn't know how to respond. Her hypothesis reframed everything. If Atlas's function was not to destroy, but to erase, then its passage through the solar system was not invasion, it was maintenance, a cosmic act of mercy, performed in the language of entropy. Within weeks, a strange consensus began to form among physicists and philosophers alike. The data matched too well, the patterns too precise. The theory became known as the Voss principle. The universe sustains itself through selective forgetting. It was controversial, heretical even, a direct challenge to the human obsession with permanence. But to those who studied the remnants of the Atlas event, it explained everything. Why the signals faded, why Venus survived, why light itself seemed to lose interest. The cosmos is not a story, one researcher summarized, it's an eraser. Voss's final note, discovered months later in her analog journal, was written in smaller, uneven handwriting. No calculations this time, just one quiet thought, as if meant for anyone who might still be listening. If light can learn to forget, maybe we can too. The Venusian pulse. It began as a rumor, the kind that spreads through tired voices in underground labs, spoken quietly over coffee in rooms lit by flickering monitors. A whisper of a signal, faint but steady, coming from where there should have been nothing at all. Venus was silent. Its atmosphere was blind, its orbit cold, its surface hidden behind veils of sulfur and memory. And yet, something was there, a pulse. It was first detected by a retired weather satellite, a relic of the early 2000s, orbiting far beyond its operational lifespan. Its sensors had degraded to the point of unreliability. So when the system registered rhythmic interference, the engineers dismissed it as solar noise. But one technician, a graduate student with insomnia and curiosity, decided to listen to the raw data anyway. He filtered the static, slowed it down, and what remained was astonishingly simple: a repeating interval. Not every minute, not 61 seconds, 72. A slow, deliberate rhythm, almost human. The student sent the recording to ESA's Deep Space Network in Madrid. The response was silence, followed by an encrypted request for all related data. Within days, the signal was verified independently by 2 observatories and a private listening post in New Zealand. The conclusion was unanimous. Venus was emitting a pulse. It was faint, weaker than the cosmic background radiation itself, but consistent. Each burst lasted less than half a second. Each one repeated precisely every 72 seconds. And when the signal was analyzed spectrally, its shape was unmistakable. A waveform almost identical to a human heartbeat. At first, the coincidence was dismissed as poetic exaggeration, but the mathematics didn't lie. The timing, the spacing, even the secondary harmonics matched the biological pattern of systole and diastole. It was, as one analyst wrote, a planetary arrhythmia. But the comparison didn't stop there. When the intervals were converted into sound, when the raw radio pattern was shifted into the audible range, the effect was chilling. It didn't sound like a machine. It sounded alive. Not like a heart in motion, but like a memory of one. The signal was nicknamed the Venusian Pulse. News outlets picked up fragments of the story, but by then, most of the data had already been classified. Officially, the pulse was described as a post-atmospheric resonance artifact. Unofficially, the researchers knew better. Dr. Mendez, in his final public statement before resigning from the International Observatory, said only this: "We used to think memory fades, but maybe it migrates." Months passed. The signal continued, unchanged. It neither strengthened nor weakened. It simply persisted, like breathing beneath layers of stone. Somewhere within the dense Venusian clouds, beneath pressure 90 times that of Earth, something was transmitting a steady rhythm. Not data, not light, just a pulse. Theories multiplied. Some said it was thermal oscillation from residual Atlas material. Others proposed it was Venus itself, its new magnetic structure producing periodic emissions through self-stabilization. But the most unsettling idea came from the surviving notes of Dr. Eleanor Voss. In one of her earlier drafts of The Law of Forgetting, she had written a marginal line that few had noticed until now. Forgetting is not silence. It is a heartbeat slowed to the pace of equilibrium. The team at JAXA compared the current pulse to archival Atlas signals. The discovery was immediate. The waveform wasn't random. It contained faint recursive modulations. Each 72-second cycle included a compressed echo of the previous one. Every repetition carried a trace of its past, diminished but not erased. The signal was learning. Not the way machines learn, but the way a living system adapts, absorbing, balancing, forgetting just enough to continue. When the data was converted to visual form, the scientists expected noise. What they saw instead was something eerily familiar. The pattern of amplitude peaks, when mapped across time, formed a symmetrical spiral, not random turbulence, but order born of repetition. It was the same shape that had once marked Atlas's descent through Earth's atmosphere. The same geometry burned into the Pacific sky, the spiral of memory. "It's still there," Mendez whispered as the image appeared. "But it's not the same. It's breathing differently now." Late one night, a young researcher at the Madrid station decided to amplify the last set of recordings. She filtered the noise, aligned the pulse, and played it through the lab speakers. For a moment, the room filled with a low, slow thrum. The sound wasn't loud, just steady, deep, resonant. The pulse filled the space like a slow drumbeat. Every 72 seconds, it returned, not perfectly identical, but slightly warmer, slightly more organic. The researcher leaned back, eyes unfocused, listening to the rhythm fade into her own heartbeat. And for a brief, terrifying instant, the two seemed to synchronize. The next morning, she wrote a single note in her logbook. "The signal adapts to the observer." Then she closed the file and went home. No further transmissions were recorded that week. The Venusian pulse fell silent for 7 days, then resumed, slightly altered. Its frequency had shifted upward by a fraction of a hertz, exactly matching the woman's recorded heart rate at the time of her final observation. It was as if the planet had listened back. By the end of that year, the pulse was declared a stable atmospheric phenomenon. But among those who had heard it, those who had felt it, there was a quiet understanding that no one dared to write down. Venus was not dead, it was dreaming, and the dream had rhythm. The quiet orbit. There was no announcement, no discovery broadcast, no global alert, just a quiet correction in the data. Venus's orbital period had changed. At first, the difference was barely perceptible, a few seconds per solar day, but the numbers held. The planet was slowing down, not chaotically, not collapsing, just easing, like a body exhaling after years of tension. And for those who still watched, who still pointed telescopes at that dim ochre sphere, it was as if the planet had entered a kind of rest, not death, something gentler. The shift was first detected by the tracking stations in Canberra. The radar echoes that once returned precisely every 243 Earth days now arrived a fraction later. The difference grew with each rotation. By week's end, the drift was measurable. Venus's rotation had slowed by 0.15%. In human terms, that's nothing. But in the language of planets, it's the difference between motion and memory. The data was cross-checked, recalibrated, confirmed. The equations refused to lie. Venus was no longer the same world. Its upper atmosphere showed subtle reorganization. Wind speeds had fallen. The super-rotating cloud decks, once raging at hundreds of kilometers per hour, had softened into a stable spiral. The sulfur storms had quieted. The turbulence was gone. It was as though something inside the planet had redefined balance itself. It's as if the entire planet is sleeping, Mendez wrote in his private notes, an orbiting organism entering rest. He compared the shift to a human heartbeat slowing after exertion, the cosmic equivalent of recovery. And the metaphor wasn't lost on anyone. Since the appearance of the Venusian pulse, the planet had behaved less like a rock and more like a living system, breathing, adjusting, remembering, and forgetting. Now it had settled into silence. Infrared mapping revealed one final anomaly. At the planet's equator, the site of the old Atlas impact, a region of lower albedo persisted, a faintly darker patch, circular and precise. It radiated almost no heat, no electromagnetic activity, Nothing to suggest structure or movement, but it was there, a scar, or perhaps a seal. Atlas is gone, one report read, or perhaps it is the seal. For months, that patch remained unchanged. Then, one morning, as the planet's slow rotation carried it into sunlight, a faint glow emerged from within. It wasn't bright enough to detect invisible wavelengths, but the instruments caught it, a soft bloom of energy, lasting exactly 72 seconds, the same rhythm as the Venusian pulse, the same duration as the slow heartbeat that now defined the planet's new rhythm. The glow faded, leaving no trace, but it confirmed what the researchers already suspected. Atlas hadn't vanished. It had been absorbed, dissolved into the deep geological strata, its geometry reconfigured into the natural patterns of the planet's rotation. Venus itself was the machine now. The orbit was its new clock. The pulse, its quiet signal to the universe. I remember enough to rest. Dr. Mendez, in his final report before his disappearance from public record, wrote one line that the committee later redacted. It was recovered only through an unofficial transcript. Venus is not orbiting the Sun anymore. It's orbiting its own memory. As years passed, the scientific community lost interest. Funding shifted. Attention drifted to new frontiers, new comets, new dangers. The event became a myth, a footnote in astrophysics textbooks, reduced to a line about atmospheric stabilization phenomena. But a few listeners, those who had once watched the skies during the Red Mirror, kept their receivers on. They still heard it sometimes, a slow, distant throb beneath cosmic static. Every 72 seconds, faint, steady, alive. No new signals ever came, no new pulses, no new data, just that quiet rhythm, echoing through an orbit too patient to be measured in days. A reminder that even silence can have structure, that stillness is not emptiness, that memory, once learned by matter, can become motion itself. And so Venus drifted through the void, turning a little slower with each cycle, its clouds smoothing into glass-like calm. It no longer burned, it no longer sang. It simply was, a perfect balance between what had been remembered and what had been let go. Epilogue: The sky that forgets. The sky was quieter now, not silent, not empty, just quieter, as though it had learned restraint. The winds still moved, the stars still turned, the sun still burned. But something about the world had softened. Even light, once sharp and impatient, seemed to fall more gently upon the earth. Astronomers stopped talking about Venus. Its name had become an elegy, a reminder of something that could no longer be measured or seen. It was still there, orbiting the sun like all the others, but in every telescope it appeared duller, as if light itself refused to disturb its sleep. And perhaps that was mercy. Perhaps the cosmos, in its vast, unfeeling wisdom, had granted one of its worlds the simplest of gifts, the ability to forget. In the observatories that still listened, the remaining scientists called this new quiet state the forgetting. It wasn't a collapse, they said, but an equilibrium, the sound of a system at peace with its own erasure. Every reading, every graph, every whisper of radiation told the same story. Venus had found balance. It had remembered just enough to stop needing to remember at all. Mendez's final paper, published anonymously after his disappearance, summarized it in a single sentence. When memory becomes complete, it turns into silence. Months passed, then years. No new pulses came. The Venusian sky stayed dark, and yet the world didn't feel diminished. Instead, humanity began to notice small, almost imperceptible changes here at home. The magnetic field of Earth stabilized. Solar radiation dropped to unusually calm levels. Storms grew rarer, more deliberate, as though even chaos had learned a slower rhythm. The world had, in its own way, begun to breathe differently. Some said it was coincidence. Others whispered that the two worlds had always been coupled, twin lungs in the body of the solar system, and that now, after one had exhaled for the last time, the other was learning to inhale in silence. One evening, during the height of summer, a photographer in Patagonia captured a strange glow on the horizon, a faint reflection that shouldn't have been there. He assumed it was an atmospheric mirage, but when he enhanced the image, the light formed a pattern, a thin, golden spiral, barely visible, hovering just above the edge of the sea. It lasted less than a minute, then vanished without a trace. When compared to archival data, the spiral matched perfectly with the geometry of the original Atlas descent. Not a return, just an echo, a soft, luminous memory of what the sky used to remember. In the years that followed, Voss's notes were reinterpreted, mythologized, woven into the fabric of a new philosophy. She became something more than a scientist, a symbol of the idea that the universe was not cruel, only patient. That forgetting wasn't loss, but restoration. A small plaque outside the ruins of her observatory bears her final words. It didn't destroy us. It only changed the air we breathe. People visit it sometimes. Students, wanderers, believers. They stand there in the wind, look up at the pale, sleeping orb above the horizon, and for a moment, they imagine they can hear it, a slow pulse, steady, ancient, somewhere beneath the noise of their own hearts. Space agencies still track Venus, of course. Its orbit remains predictable, its presence reliable, but its surface data, its thermal maps, its radar reflections, its electromagnetic chatter, is gone, as though the planet had withdrawn from the conversation of light. The scientists describe it as radiative silence. The poets call it mercy. And every so often, when the night is perfectly clear, someone claims to see a faint glimmer around its rim, a dim red shimmer like breath caught in glass. It fades before anyone else can confirm it, but those who've seen it don't try to prove it. They simply nod and say, "She's still dreaming." Every planet dreams differently, Voss once wrote. Ours dreams in silence. Venus dreams in fire. No one knows what Atlas was. A visitor, a mirror, a correction. Maybe it was all of these, or something beyond them. But whatever it was, it left the universe quieter than before. And maybe that was the point. At the edge of dawn, when the sun rises and the horizon brightens to gold, the sky looks empty. But in that emptiness, there's something vast, something still listening, a memory that learned to rest, a silence that remembers warmth, the forgotten horizon.